Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most haunting what-ifs, a question that's kept historians awake for centuries and might just change how you see the modern world. What if the Black Death, that apocalyptic pandemic that wiped out half of Europe in the 14th century, had never happened at all? Now, before you settle in with your evening tea or late-night coffee, take a moment to like this video if you're genuinely curious about alternate history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together to explore these deep historical mysteries. Dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, because we're about to embark on a journey through time that's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about how our world came to be. This isn't just another history lesson. This is a complete reimagining of human civilization, one where a single biological event that never occurred would have left us living in a world so different, so alien, that you might not even recognize it. The year is 1347, and across the known world, something is stirring. Not the plague, not yet, not in our story. Instead, Europe is experiencing something unprecedented, something that would have continued uninterrupted had history taken a different turn. The continent is booming, population is exploding, cities are growing, and the entire medieval world is hurtling toward a crisis that makes the Black Death look like a gentle interruption. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with what actually happened, because to understand the world we lost, we first need to understand the world we gained through catastrophe. Picture this. You're a merchant in the bustling port city of Kaffa, modern-day Ukraine, in the year 1346. The air is thick with the scent of spices from distant lands, the chatter of a dozen languages, and the constant bustle of trade that connects Europe to Asia. Life is good, business is booming, the future looks bright. Then, without warning, people start dying. It begins slowly, almost imperceptibly. A dock worker here, a trader there. But within weeks, bodies are piling up faster than they can be buried. The symptoms are horrifying beyond description. Victims develop painful swellings called buboes in their groin, armpits, and neck. These grotesque lumps, sometimes growing as large as apples, turn black and ooze blood and pus. Fever ravages the body. Victims vomit blood. Their skin turns dark with hemorrhaging, earning the disease its terrifying nickname. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. What followed was nothing short of apocalyptic. This wasn't just a disease. This was the end of the world as medieval people knew it. The plague spread with terrifying speed, following trade routes like a malevolent ghost, city to city, village to village, leaving devastation in its wake that defied comprehension. In just 6 years, from 1347 to 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. In Europe alone, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire population simply vanished. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Cities that had thrived for centuries became ghost towns. In some regions, the mortality rate reached a staggering 90%. To put this in perspective, imagine if tomorrow, half of everyone you know simply died. Your neighbors, your co-workers, your family members. Imagine walking through your city and seeing more empty houses than occupied ones. Imagine entire professions disappearing because there's no one left alive who knows how to do the work. That was Europe in the aftermath of the Black Death. But here's where it gets interesting, where the story takes a turn that might surprise you. This catastrophic die-off, this unthinkable human tragedy, accidentally became one of the most transformative events in human history. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed the old world and birthed something entirely new. Before the plague, Europe was locked in a rigid, feudal system that had persisted for centuries. Picture a society where your birth determined your entire life's trajectory. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a serf, tied to the land of some lord, You and your children and your children's children would remain tied to that same patch of earth forever. Social mobility was virtually non-existent. The rich stayed rich, the poor stayed poor, and everyone knew their place. The feudal pyramid was absolute. At the top sat the king, blessed by God himself. Below him, the nobles who owned vast estates. Below them, the knights who served as enforcers. And at the bottom, making up roughly 90% of the population, the peasants and serfs who worked the land and produced the wealth that supported everyone above them. This system worked because labor was abundant and land was scarce. With so many people competing for so few opportunities, workers had no bargaining power. Lords could pay starvation wages because there was always someone desperate enough to accept them. The church reinforced this system by teaching that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that questioning your place in society was tantamount to questioning God himself. Then the plague came, and suddenly everything changed. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that half your workforce has vanished overnight. That's essentially what happened to medieval lords and employers. The labor shortage was so severe, so immediate, that the entire economic foundation of feudalism cracked like an egg. Suddenly, surviving peasants found themselves in a position they'd never experienced before. They had leverage. Lords who had once treated them like disposable property now desperately needed their labor. Wages skyrocketed. Working conditions improved. Serfs began abandoning their traditional lords and seeking better opportunities elsewhere. This was revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people had choices. They could negotiate. They could demand better treatment. They could, quite literally, walk away from bad situations and find something better. The psychological impact was just as profound as the economic one. The plague shattered people's faith in traditional authority. The church, which had promised divine protection, had been powerless to stop the dying. Priests died alongside their parishioners. Bishops fled their posts. The nobility, supposedly blessed by God with superior virtue, died just as horribly as the lowest peasant. If God allowed this to happen, people began to ask, what did that say about the supposed divine order of society? If the church couldn't protect them, why should they continue to obey without question? If nobles were just as vulnerable as commoners, what made them inherently superior? These were dangerous questions, questions that would have been unthinkable before the plague. But trauma has a way of forcing people to reevaluate everything they've taken for granted. Art and literature reflected this new worldview. The medieval obsession with death, the dance of death motifs that appeared everywhere, weren't just morbid fascination. They were philosophical statements. Death, the great equalizer, made a mockery of social hierarchy. In the grave, the king and the peasant were indistinguishable. But alongside this obsession with mortality came something else, something that would prove even more transformative. A renewed appreciation for life, for human experience, for individual achievement. If life was short and death was certain, then perhaps it was worth making the most of the time you had. Perhaps human beings were more than just cogs in a divinely ordained machine. This shifting consciousness would eventually blossom into the Renaissance, that explosion of art, literature, science, and human achievement that we still celebrate today. The Renaissance didn't happen despite the Black Death. In many ways, it happened because of it. The economic changes were equally dramatic. The labor shortage forced technological innovation. When you don't have enough people to do work by hand, you start looking for machines to help. Water mills, windmills, and early mechanical devices proliferated. The seeds of what would eventually become the Industrial Revolution were planted in the post-plague labor shortage. Urbanization accelerated as people abandoned the countryside for opportunities in towns and cities. The growth of urban centers created new markets, new opportunities for trade, and new social structures that had nothing to do with traditional feudal relationships. Women, previously confined to domestic roles, found new opportunities as the labor shortage opened up professions that had been exclusively male. The nuclear family began to replace extended clan structures. Geographic mobility increased as people moved to find work. Banking and finance evolved to serve this new, more dynamic economy. The Italian banking houses that would finance the Renaissance got their start managing the complex financial needs of post-plague Europe. International trade networks expanded as cities competed for skilled workers and luxury goods. Even exploration and colonization were indirect consequences of the plague. The demographic collapse freed up resources that had been tied up in subsistence agriculture. The technological innovations driven by labor shortage eventually produced the ships and navigation tools that would carry Europeans to the New World. Religious authority, shaken by the plague, never fully recovered. The questioning of traditional doctrine that began in the immediate aftermath would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. The scientific revolution that followed was built on this foundation of questioning authority and seeking empirical truth. In short, the Black Death accidentally created the modern world. The demographic catastrophe that killed half of Europe also killed medieval civilization and gave birth to something recognizably modern: individualism, capitalism, scientific inquiry, religious pluralism, and social mobility. But what if none of this had happened? What if the plague had burned itself out in the Asian steppes before ever reaching European shores? What if that merchant ship carrying infected rats had sunk in a storm before reaching Kaffa? What if the bacterial mutation that made Yersinia pestis so virulent had never occurred? What if the Black Death had never happened at all? To answer that question, we need to understand exactly what Europe looked like on the eve of the plague, because that world, frozen in amber, would have continued developing along its existing trajectory. And that trajectory was heading toward a crisis that might have been even more catastrophic than the plague itself. Medieval Europe in 1300 was experiencing unprecedented growth. Since the year 1000, the population had doubled, then tripled. New technologies had revolutionized agriculture: the heavy plough, the three-field system, improved harnesses for horses. All of these innovations had dramatically increased food production. Crop yields had multiplied threefold in some regions. This agricultural revolution supported massive population growth and the development of increasingly sophisticated urban centres. Paris had grown to perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world. London, Florence, Venice, and other European cities were thriving centres of trade and culture. The Gothic cathedrals rising across the continent were architectural marvels that surpassed even the Great Pyramid of Giza in height. Universities were founded in Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, and Bologna. A renaissance of learning was already underway, centuries before what we call the Renaissance. This was the medieval warm period, and Europe was making the most of it. Warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, better harvests, and expansion into previously marginal agricultural land. Vikings had established settlements in Greenland and even reached North America. The future looked limitless. But there were cracks in this golden facade, warning signs that medieval chroniclers noted with growing alarm. The population was pressing against the limits of agricultural capacity. Increasingly marginal land was being brought under cultivation with diminishing returns. Periodic famines were becoming more common and more severe. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already demonstrated Europe's vulnerability. Crop failures across the continent killed perhaps 10% of the population, less than a generation before the Black Death would arrive. In France alone, widespread famines occurred in 1304, 1305, 1310, 1315, 1322, 1325, 1330, 1344, and would have continued without the demographic relief provided by the plague. Climate was turning against Europe as well. The medieval warm period was ending, giving way to what historians call the Little Ice Age. Cooler, wetter weather was depressing crop yields, just as population pressure was reaching critical levels. The perfect storm was brewing. In our alternate timeline, where the Black Death never occurs, this crisis would have continued to intensify. Europe was approaching what economists call a Malthusian trap, the point where population growth outstrips the capacity to feed everyone. In such a scenario, famine, warfare, and social collapse become inevitable. Without the demographic relief provided by the plague, Europe would have faced a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Imagine the Great Famine of 1315, but lasting for decades. Imagine social unrest as starving populations turned on each other. Imagine wars fought not for glory or territory, but for basic survival. Some historians suggest that the resulting famines could have been even more devastating than the Black Death itself. Prolonged starvation leads to social breakdown, cannibalism, and violence that makes even pandemic mortality look merciful by comparison. China experienced several such crises during periods of overpopulation, and the results were horrific. But let's imagine that somehow Europe managed to muddle through this crisis without complete collapse. What would the world look like today if medieval civilization had simply continued along its existing trajectory? The answer might surprise you, and it might disturb you. Stay with me, because we're about to explore a world where feudalism never died, where social mobility remained a fantasy, where technological progress stagnated for centuries, and where the values we take for granted today, individual rights, scientific inquiry, religious freedom, might never have emerged at all. This is the world we lost when the Black Death accidentally saved us from ourselves. In this alternate world where the Black Death never arrived, Europe's path forward becomes increasingly grim. The population explosion that had been building since the year 1000 continues unchecked, creating a powder keg of social tensions that would reshape the continent in ways far more brutal than any pandemic. By 1350, when historically the plague would have been devastating Europe, our alternate timeline sees the population continuing its relentless climb. What had been 74 million people in 1300 swells to perhaps 90 million, then 100 million. Every patch of arable land is under cultivation. Forests are cleared to make room for more fields. Marginal soils that should never have been farmed are pressed into service to feed the growing masses. But here's the cruel mathematics of medieval agriculture. You can only squeeze so much grain from the earth, and Europe had already reached that limit before the plague historically intervened. In our timeline, where the demographic pressure never relents, the situation becomes desperate. The Little Ice Age, that climatic cooling that was already beginning to affect harvests, hits this overpopulated Europe like a sledgehammer. Cooler summers mean shorter growing seasons. Wetter weather rots crops in the fields. What had been periodic famines now become a way of life. Imagine the Great Famine of 1315, but stretching across decades instead of years. Imagine entire generations that never know what it means to have enough to eat. The chroniclers of this alternate world would write of children born during famine years who never grow to full height, of villages where the sound of laughter disappears, of a continent where hunger becomes the defining feature of human existence. But the real horror wouldn't be the hunger itself. It would be what hunger does to human society. In our world, with continued population pressure and insufficient food, the rigid feudal hierarchy doesn't just persist. It becomes even more oppressive. When there are 10 peasants competing for every scrap of work, lords can demand anything they want. Wages, already at subsistence levels, would be driven even lower. The brief moments of peasant prosperity that historically occurred in the post-plague period would never materialize. Serfdom, That system of bound labour that historically began to crumble after the Black Death would instead solidify into something approaching chattel slavery. When people are starving, they'll accept any terms for survival. Lords could demand not just labour, but absolute obedience. The legal protections that peasants had slowly accumulated over centuries would be stripped away by desperate circumstances. Picture a world where the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, that great uprising that historically followed the demographic changes of the plague, never happens because the peasants never gain enough leverage to dream of rebellion. Instead, you have a population that grows more docile with each generation, ground down by perpetual hunger and hopelessness. The psychological impact would be profound. Medieval chroniclers already wrote about the despair that gripped communities during famines. They described mothers abandoning children they couldn't feed, families dissolving as members scattered in search of food, entire villages becoming ghost towns as people fled in search of better conditions that never materialized. In our alternate timeline, this wouldn't be a temporary crisis, but a permanent condition. The social fabric would fray in ways that make the trauma of the Black Death look almost gentle by comparison. At least plague victims died quickly. Starvation is a slow torture that can last for months, destroying not just bodies, but souls. Religious authority, instead of being challenged as it was historically by the plague's inexplicable horror, would grow stronger in this world of perpetual suffering. When people are desperate, they cling to any promise of salvation. The Catholic Church, which historically lost credibility when it couldn't protect people from disease, would instead gain power by promising that earthly suffering would be rewarded in heaven. This wouldn't be the questioning, intellectually curious Christianity that emerged from the plague years. This would be a darker faith, one that emphasized submission, acceptance of suffering, and absolute obedience to authority. The theological developments that would later fuel the Protestant Reformation, the idea that individuals could have direct relationships with God, that earthly authority could be questioned, would be stillborn in a world where survival depends on absolute conformity. The troubadours and poets who historically began to celebrate individual achievement and romantic love would instead sing songs of resignation and acceptance. Art would remain focused on religious themes, but these would be darker, more oppressive images designed to remind people of their place in a divine hierarchy that demanded suffering. But perhaps the most tragic loss in this alternate world would be the death of human potential itself. In our timeline, the labour shortage created by the plague forced technological innovation. When you don't have enough hands to do the work, you invent machines to help. The post-plague period saw an explosion of labour-saving devices, improved ploughs, better mills, mechanical clocks, and countless other innovations that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and eventually the Industrial Revolution. In our overpopulated alternate world, there would be no incentive for such innovation. When human labour is abundant and cheap, why invest in expensive machinery? Why develop new techniques when you can simply throw more bodies at any problem? This technological stagnation would have cascading effects. The improvements in metallurgy that historically emerged from the need to build better tools for smaller workforces would be delayed or never occur. The advances in engineering that came from building labour-saving devices would remain theoretical curiosities rather than practical necessities. Navigation technology, which improved partly due to the economic dynamism of the post-plague period, would develop more slowly. The great age of exploration that saw Europeans reach the Americas might be delayed by decades or centuries. Columbus might never sail, or if he does, it might be under the flag of a different nation entirely. The printing press, that revolutionary invention that democratized knowledge, might never be developed. Why invest in expensive printing technology when you have armies of scribes willing to copy manuscripts for pennies? The spread of literacy, which historically accelerated after the plague created opportunities for social advancement, would remain confined to a tiny elite. Universities, those centers of learning that proliferated across Europe in the post-plague period, would remain exclusive institutions serving only the highest nobility. The questioning spirit that emerged from plague-era trauma, the willingness to challenge traditional authority that fueled scientific advancement, would be replaced by rigid orthodoxy enforced by desperate circumstances. Medicine would remain trapped in medieval superstition. The practical urgency that historically drove medical advancement, the need to understand and treat plague, would never arise. Doctors would continue to rely on the theories of ancient Greek physicians, bloodletting, and herbal remedies that barely worked. The empirical observation that began to emerge in the post-plague period would be centuries delayed. The great medical schools that historically emerged from plague-era necessity would remain small, conservative institutions focused on preserving ancient wisdom rather than discovering new knowledge. Hospitals would remain primarily religious institutions focused on spiritual care rather than actual healing. But the effects wouldn't be limited to Europe. The global implications of this alternate timeline become staggering when you consider how European development influenced the rest of the world. Without the technological and economic dynamism that historically emerged from post-plague Europe, the great age of global exploration would unfold very differently. European ships might not develop the advanced navigation techniques and sturdy construction that allowed them to cross oceans. The compass, the astrolabe, improved sail designs, all of these might remain primitive or develop much more slowly. This could mean that other civilizations get to the Americas first. China, which historically turned inward during the Ming dynasty, might maintain its tradition of maritime exploration. Chinese treasure fleets, rather than European caravels, might be the first to establish permanent contact between the old and new worlds. Islamic maritime technology, which was already quite advanced, might leap ahead of European capabilities. Muslim traders and explorers, rather than Christian conquistadors, might be the ones to establish the first global trade networks, connecting Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The implications for the indigenous peoples of the Americas would be profound. Chinese or Islamic contact might result in very different patterns of colonization, trade, and cultural exchange. The devastating epidemics that historically wiped out Native American populations might still occur, but the political and religious structures imposed by colonizers would be entirely different. Japan, which historically isolated itself partly in response to European contact, might instead become a major maritime power. Without European pressure, Japanese society might continue developing along its existing trajectory, potentially becoming the dominant force in the Pacific centuries before European powers arrive. The economic implications ripple forward through history in fascinating ways. Without the post-plague labor shortage that historically drove wage increases and economic mobility, European capitalism might never develop its distinctive characteristics. The banking innovations that emerged from the complex financial needs of post-plague society might remain primitive. The great Italian banking houses, the Medici, the Fuggers, might never rise to prominence without the economic opportunities created by post-plague reconstruction. International finance might remain dominated by Islamic banking houses or Chinese merchant guilds. The concept of individual economic advancement, which historically emerged from the social mobility made possible by plague-era labor shortages, might remain alien to European culture. The Protestant work ethic, which some historians link to post-plague religious changes, might never develop. Manufacturing would remain small-scale and guild-controlled. The putting-out system that historically began to emerge in the post-plague period, where merchants distributed raw materials to rural workers, might never develop. Industrial production would remain concentrated in urban workshops controlled by traditional craft guilds. The great trading companies that historically emerged from post-plague European dynamism, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, might never form. Global trade might remain in the hands of traditional Islamic or Chinese merchants who had been conducting long-distance commerce for centuries. Even the concept of corporate organization might develop differently. The joint stock companies that historically emerged from the complex financial needs of post-plague Europe might never form. Business might remain organized along traditional partnership lines, limiting the accumulation of capital needed for large-scale ventures. Urban development would follow completely different patterns. The great European cities that historically exploded in size after the plague would remain relatively small. Paris might never grow beyond 200,000 inhabitants. London might remain a regional trading centre rather than becoming a global metropolis. The architectural innovations that emerge from post-plague prosperity would be delayed or never occur. The great Renaissance palaces, the Baroque churches, the neoclassical civic buildings that define European cities might never be built. European architecture might remain locked in Gothic forms or develop along entirely different lines. Social structures would calcify in ways that seem almost unimaginable to modern minds. The nuclear family, which historically began to replace extended clan structures in the post-plague period, might never emerge. European society might remain organized around extended kinship networks well into the modern period. Women's roles would remain rigidly defined. The economic opportunities that historically opened up for women during post-plague labor shortages would never materialize. The concept of individual female achievement, which began to emerge in the post-plague period, might remain foreign to European culture. Marriage patterns would remain traditional. The companionate marriage, based on mutual affection rather than purely economic considerations, might never develop. Romantic love, as celebrated in post-plague literature, might remain a luxury for the nobility rather than becoming a cultural ideal. The legal system would remain based on traditional custom rather than developing the more sophisticated frameworks that historically emerged from post-plague social complexity. The concept of individual rights, which some historians trace to post-plague social changes, might never develop. Criminal justice would remain brutal and arbitrary. The more nuanced legal thinking that historically emerged from post-plague social complexity would be delayed by centuries. Trial by ordeal, public execution, and collective punishment might remain standard practices well into the modern period. Educational systems would remain exclusive and traditional. The expansion of literacy that historically followed post-plague social mobility would never occur. The great majority of the population would remain illiterate, dependent on oral tradition and religious instruction for their understanding of the world. The vernacular languages that historically began to flourish in the post-plague period might remain subordinate to Latin much longer. The great national literatures, Dante, Chaucer, the German Minnesingers, might never develop or might emerge centuries later. Scientific thinking would remain trapped in medieval frameworks. The empirical observation that historically emerged from plague-era trauma would be delayed. The questioning of ancient authorities that began in the post-plague period would never occur. Astronomy would remain dominated by Ptolemaic theories. Physics would remain Aristotelian. Chemistry would remain alchemy. Biology would remain based on the theory of humours. The scientific revolution that historically transformed European understanding of the natural world might be delayed by centuries, but perhaps most tragically, the very concept of progress might never emerge. The idea that human society can improve, that individuals can better their conditions through effort and innovation, historically gained credibility from the dramatic social changes that followed the plague. In our alternate timeline, where social conditions remain static and oppressive, the idea of progress might seem not just impossible, but actually dangerous. A society based on rigid hierarchy and acceptance of suffering would view change as inherently destabilizing and evil. The Renaissance ideal of human dignity and potential would be stillborn. The Enlightenment concepts of reason and individual rights would have no foundation to build upon. The democratic revolutions that historically transformed the modern world would lack the intellectual and social prerequisites necessary to succeed. This is the world we lost when the Black Death accidentally saved us from ourselves. a world where human potential remained forever stunted, where progress was impossible, where the vast majority of humanity remained trapped in cycles of poverty and oppression that might have lasted for millennia. But wait, there's more to this story, because the ripple effects of this demographic catastrophe that never happened would reshape not just Europe, but the entire course of global civilization in ways that would leave our modern world utterly unrecognizable. As we peer deeper into this world where the Black Death never came, we begin to see how profoundly different the very concept of human existence would have become. This isn't just about different politics or economics. This is about a fundamentally altered understanding of what it means to be human. In our timeline, the plague created what historians call a mortality crisis that forced people to confront their own fragility in ways that medieval society had never experienced. Death, which had always been present, became so immediate and arbitrary that it shattered existing worldviews. But in our alternate world, where that crisis never occurred, European consciousness would have developed along entirely different lines. The medieval mind, which historically began to question divine authority after watching priests die helplessly alongside their flocks, would instead have remained locked in absolute certainty. The great chain of being, that cosmic hierarchy where God sat at the top and every creature had its predetermined place, would have remained unshakable doctrine. Think about what this means for human creativity and expression. The art that emerged from post-plague Europe was revolutionary precisely because it began to focus on individual human experience rather than purely religious themes. The tortured figures in late medieval art, the dance of death motifs, the growing interest in portraiture and realistic human emotion, none of this would have developed. Instead, European art would have remained trapped in the stylized, symbolic forms of high medieval culture. Religious paintings would continue to show flat, idealized figures floating in golden backgrounds. The psychological depth that historically began to emerge in post-plague art would be absent. Human faces would remain masks rather than windows into individual souls. Literature would follow a similar pattern. The great vernacular poets like Dante, who historically wrote in the aftermath of demographic crisis, would never have emerged. The Divine Comedy, with its revolutionary focus on individual spiritual journey and its willingness to place contemporary figures in hell alongside historical ones, would be unthinkable in a world where traditional authority remained unquestioned. Instead of developing rich national literatures, European culture would remain dominated by Latin religious texts. The troubadour tradition, which historically began to celebrate individual romantic experience, would remain confined to a tiny aristocratic elite. The concept of courtly love, which some historians argue was a response to the social upheavals following demographic crisis, would never develop into the broader cultural celebration of individual emotion that it became. Music would remain locked in Gregorian chant and simple religious forms. The complex polyphony that historically emerged from post-plague musical innovation would be delayed by centuries. The idea that music could express individual emotion rather than purely religious devotion would remain foreign. But the intellectual stagnation would be even more profound. The universities that historically proliferated after the plague would remain small, exclusive institutions focused on preserving ancient wisdom rather than discovering new knowledge. The scholastic method, which historically began to incorporate empirical observation, partly due to post-plague intellectual ferment, would remain purely theoretical. Philosophy would be trapped in endless commentaries on ancient texts. The nominalist revolution, which historically challenged the reality of universal concepts and laid groundwork for later scientific thinking, would never occur. The very idea that human reason could discover truth independently of religious authority would remain heretical. Legal thinking would remain primitive. The sophisticated jurisprudence that historically emerged from post-plague social complexity would never develop. Trial by ordeal would remain standard practice. The concept of individual rights, which some legal historians trace to post-plague social changes, would never emerge. Mathematical development would stagnate. The practical mathematics that historically emerged from post-plague commercial complexity would remain rudimentary. Double-entry bookkeeping, which historians link to post-plague economic sophistication, would never be invented. The mathematical innovations that later enabled scientific revolution would be delayed by centuries. Even basic concepts like mechanical clocks would develop much more slowly. The precision timekeeping that historically became important due to post-plague labor organization would remain unnecessary in a world where human time had no individual value. The implications for technological development become staggering when you consider how interconnected all these innovations were. Without the intellectual ferment that historically followed demographic crisis, without the practical pressures that drove innovation, without the social mobility that created demand for new technologies, Europe would remain technologically primitive. Watermills would remain simple grain-grinding devices rather than developing into the complex mechanical systems that historically emerged. Wind power would remain limited to basic applications. The gear trains and mechanical linkages that historically developed from post-plague innovation would never be invented. Metallurgy would remain primitive. The advanced techniques that historically emerged from post-plague demand for better tools and weapons would be delayed. Steel production would remain limited and expensive. The precision metalworking that later enabled scientific instruments would never develop. Transportation would remain medieval. The road improvements that historically followed post-plague economic development would never occur. Bridges would remain simple stone arches rather than developing into the engineering marvels that historically emerged. River navigation would remain primitive and dangerous. Communication would rely entirely on human messengers. The postal systems that historically emerged from post-plague administrative complexity would never develop. The rapid spread of information that later enabled scientific revolution would remain impossible. But perhaps most tragically, the very concept of individual human worth would never emerge. In our timeline, the labor shortage created by plague gave individual workers unprecedented value. For the first time in European history, ordinary people could negotiate, could demand better treatment, could see themselves as something more than interchangeable components in a divine machine. This psychological transformation was revolutionary. People who had never imagined themselves as anything but peasants suddenly saw possibilities for advancement. The idea that individual merit might matter more than birth became thinkable. The concept of personal ambition, previously confined to the highest nobility, began to spread down the social hierarchy. In our alternate world, none of this would occur. Human beings would remain what they had always been in medieval thinking. Souls temporarily trapped in flesh, their earthly status predetermined by divine will, their only hope for improvement lying in the afterlife. The nuclear family, which historically began to replace extended clan structures, partly due to post-plague social mobility, would never emerge. People would remain embedded in traditional kinship networks that determined their entire life trajectory. Marriage would remain purely economic, arranged by families for strategic advantage. Child-rearing would remain focused on teaching acceptance of predetermined social roles, rather than developing individual potential. Education would consist of learning one's place in the social hierarchy and the skills necessary to fulfill that role. The idea that children might grow up to live different lives than their parents would remain unthinkable. Women would remain legally and socially invisible. The economic opportunities that historically opened up for women during post-plague labor shortages would never materialize. Female literacy would remain virtually non-existent outside of convents. The concept of individual female achievement would remain foreign. Religious life would become even more oppressive. Without the questioning that historically followed plague-era trauma, the Church would face no challenges to its absolute authority. Religious doctrine would become increasingly rigid and punitive. The mystical traditions that historically emerged from post-plague spiritual searching would never develop. heresy would remain unthinkable. The religious movements that historically challenged church authority would never form. The Protestant Reformation would be impossible without the intellectual groundwork laid by post-plague religious questioning. The Inquisition, instead of being a response to perceived threats to orthodoxy, would become a permanent institution designed to prevent any questioning of religious authority. The witch trials that historically occurred partly due to post-plague social tensions would become systematic campaigns to eliminate any deviation from approved thinking. Pilgrimage would remain the only acceptable form of travel. The idea that people might journey for reasons other than religious devotion would remain suspect. Geographic mobility would be strictly controlled by religious and secular authorities. Science would remain natural philosophy, a branch of theology concerned with understanding God's creation rather than discovering natural laws. The empirical method would never develop. Experimentation would remain forbidden as an attempt to question divine creation. Astronomy would remain focused on astrological prediction rather than mathematical description. The idea that celestial motions might follow natural laws rather than divine whim would remain heretical. The telescope would never be invented, or if it were, would be used only for terrestrial observation. Medicine would remain entirely theoretical. The practical urgency that historically drove medical advancement would never arise. Anatomy would remain based on ancient texts rather than actual dissection. Surgery would remain primitive and dangerous. The concept of public health would never develop. The quarantine systems that historically emerged from plague control would never be invented. Hospitals would remain purely religious institutions focused on spiritual rather than physical healing. Urban planning would remain non-existent. Cities would continue to grow organically without any consideration for sanitation, traffic flow, or public health. The urban improvements that historically followed post-plague reconstruction would never occur. Trade would remain local and primitive. The commercial innovations that historically emerged from post-plague economic complexity would never develop. Banking would remain rudimentary. Insurance would never be invented. International commerce would remain dominated by traditional Islamic and Chinese merchants. European participation in global trade would remain minimal and unsophisticated. The great trading companies that historically emerged from post-plague European dynamism would never form. The age of exploration would unfold very differently. Without the technological and economic dynamism that historically drove European expansion, other civilizations would dominate global exploration. Chinese treasure fleets might continue sailing well into the modern period. Islamic maritime technology might leap ahead of European capabilities. The Americas would be contacted by very different civilizations, with profound implications for indigenous peoples. The patterns of colonization, trade, and cultural exchange would be entirely different. The devastating epidemics that historically wiped out Native American populations might still occur, but the political and religious structures imposed by colonizers would be unrecognizable. African societies would develop along different trajectories without European slave trading pressure. The great kingdoms of West Africa might continue flourishing without the demographic drain of the Atlantic slave trade. East African trading cities might become even more prosperous through continued trade with Chinese and Islamic merchants. Asian civilizations would remain the dominant global powers much longer. China might never turn inward, continuing its tradition of maritime exploration and technological innovation. The Islamic world might experience a continued golden age without European competition. India might remain politically fragmented but economically prosperous, continuing its traditional role as a center of global trade. The Mughal Empire might last much longer without European military pressure. The Ottoman Empire might continue expanding into Europe much further than it historically did. Without the military innovations that historically emerged from post-plague European development, European resistance to Ottoman expansion would remain weak. Eastern Europe would remain under greater Ottoman influence. The great castles and fortifications that historically protected Christian Europe might never be built. The cultural exchange between Islamic and Christian civilizations would follow entirely different patterns. Russia might remain more isolated and primitive. The technological and military innovations that historically allowed Russian expansion would be delayed. The great Russian Empire might never form, or might form much later under very different circumstances. The concept of the modern nation-state would never develop. Political organization would remain based on traditional feudal relationships rather than territorial sovereignty. The Peace of Westphalia and the principles of international law that emerged from it would never be necessary. Warfare would remain medieval in character. The military innovations that historically emerged from post-plague social and economic changes would never occur. Gunpowder weapons would develop much more slowly, if at all. Professional armies would remain small and expensive. The great fortifications that historically emerged from post-plague military innovation would never be built. Castle design would remain primitive. Siege warfare would continue to rely on traditional methods. Naval technology would remain rudimentary. The innovations in ship design that historically emerged from post-plague commercial and military needs would never occur. Ocean exploration would remain dangerous and limited. Economic theory would never develop beyond basic moral considerations. The sophisticated understanding of markets and trade that historically emerged from post-plague commercial complexity would never arise. The concept of capitalism would remain foreign. Political theory would remain focused on divine right and traditional authority. The social contract theories that historically emerged from post-plague questioning of authority would never develop. The concept of popular sovereignty would remain unthinkable. The idea of progress itself would never emerge. Without the dramatic social changes that historically followed demographic crisis, the notion that human society could improve would seem not just impossible, but actually dangerous to social stability. Revolutionary thinking would remain impossible. The intellectual frameworks that historically enabled democratic revolutions would never develop. The American and French revolutions would be unthinkable without their intellectual foundations. Human rights would remain a foreign concept. The idea that individuals possessed inherent dignity and worth would never develop. People would remain subjects rather than citizens, their value determined entirely by their social function. The abolition of slavery would be delayed by centuries, if it occurred at all. Without the intellectual and moral frameworks that historically emerged from post-plague social changes, the arguments against human bondage would lack foundation. Women's liberation would remain inconceivable. The legal and social changes that historically began to emerge in the post-plague period would never occur. Female suffrage would be delayed by centuries. Child labor would remain normal and accepted. The concept of childhood as a special period requiring protection would never develop. Children would remain small adults expected to contribute economically from an early age. Education would remain the privilege of a tiny elite. Mass literacy would never develop. The printing press, if invented at all, would remain a curiosity rather than a revolutionary technology. Scientific revolution would be impossible without the intellectual foundations that historically emerged from post-plague questioning of authority. The Enlightenment would never occur, ever. The Industrial Revolution would be delayed by centuries. Modern medicine would remain a distant dream. The practical urgency and empirical thinking that historically drove medical advancement would never develop. Life expectancy would remain short and unpredictable. The modern world as we know it would be utterly unrecognizable. The values we take for granted, individual rights, scientific thinking, democratic governance, economic opportunity, social mobility, would remain foreign concepts in a world where the Black Death never accidentally shattered medieval certainties. But the story doesn't end there. The ripple effects of this demographic catastrophe that never happened would continue to reshape human civilization in ways that become even more dramatic as we trace them forward through the centuries. The world we're imagining isn't just different, it's a world where human potential itself remained forever stunted, where the very idea of progress was not just impossible, but unthinkable. And yet, paradoxically, this might also have been a more stable world. A world without the wars and revolutions that historically followed the breakdown of traditional authority. Whether that stability would have been worth the price in human freedom and achievement is a question that haunts every historian who contemplates this darkest of alternate timelines. As we continue our journey through this world that never was, we'll discover that the absence of a single biological event would have created not just a different Europe, but a fundamentally different human species, one that never learned to question, never learned to dream, never learned to imagine that tomorrow might be better than today. The medieval world that the Black Death destroyed was not just a political and economic system. It was an entire way of being human. And in our alternate timeline, that way of being would have persisted for centuries, perhaps millennia, creating a human civilization so alien to our own experience that we might not even recognize it as human at all. But the tragedy goes deeper than just social stagnation or technological delay. In this world where the Black Death never arrived, we witness the slow death of something even more precious than individual advancement, the death of hope itself. Picture the year 1400 in our alternate timeline, where history records the beginning of early Renaissance stirrings. We instead find a Europe locked in what can only be described as a psychological prison. The population has swelled to perhaps 120 million souls, all pressed into a social machine that grinds human potential into dust with the efficiency of a watermill. In the countryside, entire families work strips of land so small that a single bad harvest means starvation. Children learn from birth that questioning their station is not just futile, but sinful. They watch their parents bow and scrape before lords who treat them like livestock. And they understand with crushing clarity that this is their destiny too. But it's not just the peasants who suffer in this world. Even the nobility finds itself trapped in a system that has calcified beyond recognition. Lords who might have historically become patrons of art and learning instead spend their lives managing increasingly desperate populations. The elegant court culture that emerged in our timeline from post-plague prosperity never develops. Instead, aristocratic life becomes a grim exercise in population control and resource management. The psychological weight of this stagnation would have profound effects on human creativity and innovation. In our timeline, the trauma of the plague paradoxically liberated the human imagination. When death could strike anyone at any time, when traditional authorities proved powerless against disease, people began to think thoughts that had been unthinkable for centuries. Artists started painting real human faces with real human emotions. Writers began exploring individual psychology rather than universal archetypes. Musicians experimented with complex harmonies that reflected the chaotic uncertainty of post-plague life. The very concept of artistic innovation emerged from the rubble of shattered certainties. But in our alternate world, where certainties were never shattered, where the social order remained as rigid as stone, the human imagination would remain similarly petrified. Art would continue to serve purely religious or ceremonial functions. The idea that creative expression might explore individual human experience would remain foreign. Think about what this means for the development of human consciousness itself. In our timeline, the Renaissance didn't just change how people made art or conducted business. It changed how people thought about thinking. The concept that human reason could discover truth, that individual observation might be more reliable than ancient authority, that personal experience had value. These ideas emerged from the intellectual ferment that followed demographic catastrophe. Without that catalyst, European consciousness would remain trapped in medieval frameworks for centuries longer. The very notion of scientific inquiry would remain not just undeveloped, but literally unthinkable. When your entire worldview is built on the premise that all truth was revealed long ago by ancient authorities, the idea of discovering new truths through experimentation becomes not just wrong, but blasphemous. This intellectual stagnation would have cascading effects on every aspect of human development. Medicine would remain dominated by the theory of humours for centuries longer than it historically did. The empirical observation that began to emerge in post-plague medical practice would never develop. Doctors would continue to treat patients by consulting ancient texts rather than examining actual symptoms. The printing press, if invented at all, would be used primarily to reproduce religious texts and ancient authorities rather than spreading new ideas. The explosion of literacy that historically followed the plague would never occur. The vast majority of the population would remain illiterate, dependent on oral tradition and religious instruction for their understanding of the world. But perhaps most tragically, the very concept of education as we understand it would never emerge. In our timeline, the social mobility created by post-plague labour shortages made education valuable as a path to advancement. People began to see literacy and numeracy as tools for improving their circumstances rather than just ornaments for the nobility. In our alternate world, where social mobility remains impossible, education would serve no practical purpose for the vast majority of the population. Why teach a serf to read when he'll spend his entire life working the same plot of land his ancestors worked? Why teach a peasant girl arithmetic when her only role is to bear children and tend house? This educational stagnation would create a self-reinforcing cycle of ignorance and oppression. Each generation would be slightly less knowledgeable than they might have been, slightly more accepting of traditional authority, slightly less capable of imagining alternatives to their circumstances. The universities that historically proliferated after the plague would remain tiny, exclusive institutions, serving only the highest nobility and clergy. The questioning spirit that emerged from plague-era trauma would never develop. Scholarship would remain focused on preserving and interpreting ancient wisdom rather than discovering new knowledge. Philosophy would be trapped in endless commentaries on Aristotle and Augustine. The nominalist revolution that historically challenged the reality of universal concepts would never occur. The empirical tradition that later enabled scientific revolution would remain stillborn. Legal thinking would remain primitive and brutal. The sophisticated jurisprudence that historically emerged from post-plague social complexity would never develop. Trial by ordeal would remain standard practice well into the modern period. The concept of individual rights would never emerge from a system that viewed people as interchangeable components in a divine machine. Mathematics would remain the province of a tiny scholarly elite concerned primarily with abstract theological questions rather than practical applications. The commercial mathematics that historically emerged from post-plague economic complexity would never develop. Double-entry bookkeeping would remain unknown. The mathematical tools that later enabled scientific revolution would be delayed by centuries. Even basic concepts like mechanical timekeeping would develop much more slowly. The precision that historically became important due to post-plague labour organisation would remain unnecessary in a world where human time had no individual value. The mechanical clocks that began to appear in post-plague Europe would remain curiosities rather than practical necessities. The implications for technological development become truly staggering when you consider how interconnected all these innovations were. Without the intellectual ferment that historically followed demographic crisis, without the practical pressures that drove innovation, without the social mobility that created demand for new technologies, Europe would remain locked in technological primitiveness. Watermills would remain simple grain-grinding devices rather than developing into the complex mechanical systems that historically emerged. The gear trains and mechanical linkages that historically developed from post-plague innovation would never be invented. The precision metalworking that later enabled scientific instruments would never develop. Metallurgy would remain primitive, limited to basic techniques known since antiquity. The advanced methods that historically emerged from post-plague demand for better tools and weapons would be delayed indefinitely. Steel production would remain expensive and limited. The quality of metal goods would remain poor. Transportation would remain medieval in character. The road improvements that historically followed post-plague economic development would never occur. Rivers would remain unbridged except by the simplest stone arches. Land travel would remain dangerous, slow, and expensive. Communication would rely entirely on human messengers traveling on foot or horseback. Navigation would remain primitive. The improvements in shipbuilding and navigation that historically emerged from post-plague maritime expansion would never occur. European ships would remain coastal vessels unsuitable for ocean travel. The great age of exploration would be delayed by centuries, if it occurred at all. But the most profound loss would be in the realm of human relationships and social organization. The nuclear family, which historically began to replace extended clan structures partly due to post-plague social mobility, would never emerge. People would remain embedded in traditional kinship networks that determined their entire life trajectory from birth to death. Marriage would remain purely economic, arranged by families for strategic advantage. The concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage would remain confined to aristocratic poetry, rather than becoming a broader cultural ideal. The companionate marriage based on mutual affection would be delayed by centuries. Child rearing would remain focused on teaching acceptance of predetermined social roles, rather than developing individual potential. Children would be viewed as economic assets, rather than individuals with inherent worth. The concept of childhood as a special period requiring protection and nurturing would never develop. Women would remain legally and socially invisible throughout their lives. The economic opportunities that historically opened up for women during post-plague labor shortages would never materialize. Female literacy would remain virtually non-existent outside of convents. Women would remain property, passed from father to husband, without ever achieving independent legal status. The very concept of individual human dignity would remain foreign. In our timeline, the labor shortage created by plague gave individual workers unprecedented value for the first time in European history. This economic reality gradually translated into a broader recognition of human worth that eventually flowered into concepts of individual rights and human dignity. In our alternate world, where human labor remains abundant and cheap, people would continue to be viewed as interchangeable components in a divine machine. The idea that individuals possessed inherent worth independent of their social function would remain unthinkable. Religious life would become increasingly oppressive as the Church faced no challenges to its absolute authority. Without the questioning that historically followed plague-era trauma, religious doctrine would become more rigid and punitive over time. The mystical traditions that historically emerged from post-plague spiritual searching would never develop. The Inquisition would become a permanent institution designed to prevent any questioning of religious authority. Heresy trials would become routine methods of social control. The witch trials that historically occurred partly due to post-plague social tensions would become systematic campaigns to eliminate any deviation from approved thinking. Pilgrimage would remain the only acceptable form of travel for ordinary people. The idea that individuals might journey for reasons other than religious devotion would remain suspect. Geographic mobility would be strictly controlled by religious and secular authorities working in close cooperation. The monastic life would become increasingly attractive as one of the few paths offering any escape from the grinding poverty and hopelessness of secular existence. Monasteries would swell with recruits fleeing the impossibility of advancement in the outside world, but even monastic life would become more regimented and less intellectually stimulating, without the questioning spirit that historically emerged from plague-era religious ferment. Science would remain natural philosophy, a branch of theology concerned with understanding God's creation rather than discovering natural laws. The empirical method would never develop. Experimentation would remain forbidden as an attempt to question divine creation. The very concept of natural law operating independently of divine will would remain heretical. Astronomy would remain focused on astrological prediction rather than mathematical description of celestial motions. The idea that heavenly bodies might follow predictable patterns rather than expressing divine whim would remain unthinkable. The telescope would never be invented, or if it were, would be suppressed as a blasphemous attempt to spy on God's domain. Medicine would remain entirely theoretical, based on ancient texts rather than clinical observation. The practical urgency that historically drove medical advancement would never arise without the recurring plague outbreaks that forced doctors to actually observe and treat disease. Anatomy would remain based on the writings of Galen, rather than actual dissection of human bodies. Surgery would remain primitive and dangerous, practiced mainly by barbers and other non-medical practitioners. The surgical innovations that historically emerged from plague-era necessity would never develop. Hospitals would remain purely religious institutions focused on spiritual comfort rather than actual healing. The concept of public health would never emerge without the practical challenges posed by recurring disease outbreaks. The quarantine systems and sanitation measures that historically developed from plague control would never be invented. Cities would continue to grow without any consideration for public hygiene or disease prevention. Urban planning would remain non-existent. Cities would continue to develop organically as dense, unsanitary warrens of narrow streets and overcrowded buildings. The urban improvements that historically followed post-plague reconstruction would never occur. Fire and disease would remain constant urban hazards. Trade would remain local and primitive without the commercial innovations that historically emerged from post-plague economic complexity. Banking would remain rudimentary, limited to simple money changing and basic loans. The sophisticated financial instruments that historically enabled long-distance commerce would never be invented. International trade would remain dominated by traditional Islamic and Chinese merchants who had been conducting sophisticated commerce for centuries. European participation in global trade would remain minimal and unsophisticated. The great trading companies that historically emerged from post-plague European dynamism would never form. The Mediterranean would remain essentially a Muslim lake, with Christian Europeans confined to coastal trading posts, rather than becoming major maritime powers. The Atlantic would remain unexplored by Europeans, who would lack both the technology and the economic motivation for ocean voyaging. The age of exploration would unfold very differently, with other civilizations taking the lead in global maritime expansion. Chinese treasure fleets might continue sailing well into the modern period, establishing Chinese colonies and trading posts around the Indian Ocean, and perhaps even reaching the Americas centuries before Europeans. Islamic maritime technology might leap ahead of European capabilities, with Muslim explorers establishing the first regular contact between the old and new worlds. The patterns of colonization, trade, and cultural exchange would be entirely different from what historically occurred. The Americas would be contacted by civilizations with very different cultural values and technological capabilities. The devastating epidemics that historically wiped out Native American populations might still occur, but the political, religious, and economic structures imposed by colonizers would be unrecognizable. The absence of European colonial pressure would allow African societies to develop along entirely different trajectories. The great kingdoms of West Africa might continue flourishing without the demographic drain of the Atlantic slave trade. East African trading cities might become even more prosperous through continued trade with Chinese and Islamic merchants. Asian civilizations would remain the dominant global powers much longer than they historically did. China might never turn inward, continuing its tradition of maritime exploration and technological innovation. The Islamic world might experience a continued golden age without European military and economic competition. India might remain politically fragmented but economically prosperous, continuing its traditional role as the center of global trade networks. The Mughal Empire might last much longer, without European military pressure and economic interference. The Ottoman Empire might continue expanding into Europe much further than it historically did. Without the military innovations that historically emerged from post-plague European development, European resistance to Ottoman expansion would remain weak and disorganized. Eastern Europe would remain under much greater Islamic influence. The great castles and fortifications that historically protected Christian Europe might never be built. The cultural exchange between Islamic and Christian civilizations would follow entirely different patterns, with Islam likely gaining converts rather than losing ground. Russia might remain more isolated and primitive without the technological and military innovations that historically enabled Russian expansion. The Great Russian Empire might never form, or might form much later under very different circumstances. The steppes might remain dominated by nomadic peoples for centuries longer. The concept of the modern nation-state would never develop without the complex political pressures that historically emerged from post-plague social changes. Political organization would remain based on traditional feudal relationships rather than territorial sovereignty. The Peace of Westphalia and the principles of international law that emerged from it would never be necessary. Warfare would remain medieval in character for centuries longer than it historically did. The military innovations that historically emerged from post-plague social and economic changes would never occur. Professional armies would remain small, expensive, and primitive. Gunpowder weapons would develop much more slowly, if at all. The great fortifications that historically emerged from post-plague military innovation would never be built. Castle design would remain primitive. Siege warfare would continue to rely on traditional methods like catapults and battering rams. The revolution in military engineering that historically transformed European warfare would be delayed indefinitely. Naval technology would remain rudimentary without the innovations that historically emerged from post-plague commercial and military needs. European ships would remain coastal vessels unsuitable for ocean exploration. The galleon, the caravel, and other innovations that enabled the age of exploration would never be developed. Economic theory would never develop beyond basic moral considerations about just price and usury. The sophisticated understanding of markets and trade that historically emerged from post-plague commercial complexity would never arise. The concept of capitalism as an economic system would remain foreign to European thinking. Political theory would remain focused on divine right and traditional authority, without the questioning that historically emerged from post-plague social upheaval. The social contract theories that later enabled democratic revolutions would never develop. The concept of popular sovereignty would remain not just impractical, but literally unthinkable. The idea of progress itself would never emerge as a cultural concept. Without the dramatic social changes that historically followed demographic crisis, the notion that human society could improve over time would seem not just impossible, but actually dangerous to social stability. Revolutionary thinking would remain impossible without the intellectual frameworks that historically enabled it. The American and French revolutions would be unthinkable without their intellectual foundations in post-plague European thought. The very concept of revolution as positive social change would never develop. Human rights would remain a foreign concept for centuries longer than they historically did. The idea that individuals possessed inherent dignity and worth independent of their social function would never develop. People would remain subjects rather than citizens, their value determined entirely by their usefulness to their social superiors. The abolition of slavery would be delayed by centuries, if it occurred at all. Without the intellectual and moral frameworks that historically emerged from post-plague social changes, the arguments against human bondage would lack any foundation. Slavery and serfdom would remain normal and accepted parts of the social order. Women's liberation would remain inconceivable without the economic and social changes that historically began to emerge in the post-plague period. The legal and social changes that eventually led to female suffrage would never occur. Women would remain legal minors throughout their lives, unable to own property, enter contracts, or participate in public life. Child labour would remain normal and accepted without the economic changes that historically made childhood education valuable. The concept of childhood as a special period requiring protection and nurturing would never develop. Children would remain small adults expected to contribute economically from the earliest possible age. Education would remain the privilege of a tiny elite without the social mobility that historically made literacy valuable to ordinary people. Mass literacy would never develop. The printing press, if invented at all, would remain a curiosity rather than a revolutionary technology for spreading knowledge. The scientific revolution would be impossible without the intellectual foundations that historically emerged from post-plague questioning of traditional authority. The Enlightenment would never occur. The Industrial Revolution would be delayed by centuries if it occurred at all. Modern medicine would remain a distant dream without the practical urgency and empirical thinking that historically drove medical advancement. Life expectancy would remain short and unpredictable. The great killers of antiquity, smallpox, typhus, cholera, would continue claiming millions of lives well into the modern period. The modern world as we know it would be utterly unrecognizable. The values we take for granted, individual rights, scientific thinking, democratic governance, economic opportunity, social mobility, would remain foreign concepts in a world where the Black Death never accidentally shattered medieval certainties. But perhaps the most profound difference would be in the realm of human consciousness itself. We live in a world where people believe they can improve their circumstances through effort and innovation. We take for granted the idea that tomorrow might be better than today, that children might live better lives than their parents, that human society can progress and develop. These beliefs, so fundamental to our worldview that we rarely examine them, emerge from the specific historical circumstances that followed the Black Death. The demographic catastrophe accidentally proved that dramatic social change was possible, that traditional authorities could fail, that the future might be fundamentally different from the past. In our alternate world, where these lessons were never learned, human consciousness would remain trapped in medieval frameworks of thought. People would believe that social change was impossible, that traditional authorities were divinely appointed, that the future would inevitably resemble the past. This isn't just about different political systems or economic arrangements. This is about a fundamentally different way of being human. In our alternate timeline, humans would remain creatures of tradition and hierarchy, accepting their circumstances with resignation, rather than seeking to improve them through effort and innovation. The very concept of ambition, at least as we understand it, would remain foreign. People might aspire to fulfill their traditional roles well, but the idea of transcending those roles would be literally unthinkable. The American dream of social mobility through individual effort would remain an impossible fantasy. Creativity would remain channeled into traditional forms serving established purposes. The idea that art might explore new themes, that music might experiment with new sounds, that literature might examine previously unexplored aspects of human experience would never develop. Innovation would remain confined to minor improvements in traditional techniques. The idea of fundamental technological or social breakthroughs would remain inconceivable. Change, when it occurred at all, would be gradual and incremental, spread over centuries rather than decades. The pace of human development would remain glacially slow. Centuries would pass with little apparent change in how people lived, worked, or thought. The accelerating pace of change that we take for granted in the modern world would never develop. This might, paradoxically, have created a more psychologically stable world. Without the constant pressure to adapt to changing circumstances, without the anxiety that comes from rapid social transformation, people might have experienced less stress and uncertainty than we do today. But this stability would have come at an enormous cost in human potential. Millions of people who might have become artists, scientists, inventors, or leaders would instead live and die as anonymous peasants, their talents never discovered or developed. The collective human potential lost in such a world is almost impossible to calculate. How many Shakespeares never wrote because they couldn't read? How many Newtons never investigated because they were too busy ploughing fields? How many Beethovens never composed because they never heard music beyond simple folk songs? This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of our alternate timeline. Not just the political oppression or economic stagnation, but the waste of human potential on an unimaginable scale. A world where the vast majority of humanity lived and died without ever discovering what they might have been capable of achieving. Yet as we contemplate this darker timeline, we must also acknowledge that it represents a path not taken rather than an inevitable fate. The Black Death was a biological accident, a random mutation that happened to create the conditions for European social transformation. Other societies faced similar challenges and responded differently. China experienced massive demographic collapses from disease and warfare, but maintained its traditional social structures for much longer than Europe did. The Islamic world faced plague outbreaks, but never experienced the same degree of social transformation. These societies developed sophisticated technologies and cultural achievements without undergoing the specific changes that shaped post-plague Europe. This suggests that the European path to modernity was not inevitable, but contingent on specific historical circumstances. In our alternate timeline, human civilization might have developed along different lines, perhaps more stable and harmonious, but also more limited in its achievements and possibilities. The question of whether such a world would have been better or worse than our own is impossible to answer definitively. It would have been a world with less violence and upheaval, but also less freedom and opportunity. A world with greater social harmony, but also greater inequality and oppression. A world more in tune with natural rhythms, but also more vulnerable to natural disasters. What seems certain is that it would have been a profoundly different world, one where human beings remained embedded in traditional communities and relationships, rather than becoming the mobile, individualistic creatures we are today. Whether we would recognize such humans as fully human is a question that goes to the heart of what we believe makes us who we are. As we prepare to explore the final implications of this alternate timeline, we must grapple with the possibility that the world we inhabit, with all its problems and possibilities, emerged not from inevitable progress, but from a single biological accident that killed half of Europe and accidentally created modernity itself. The Black Death may have been one of history's greatest tragedies, but it was also, paradoxically, one of its greatest gifts to human potential. In destroying the medieval world, it cleared the ground for something unprecedented in human history, a civilization based on the premise that individuals could transcend their circumstances through effort, innovation, and imagination. That such a civilization emerged from such tragedy is perhaps the most profound irony in human history. But as we're about to discover, the ripple effects of this demographic catastrophe that never occurred would extend far beyond Europe itself, reshaping global civilization in ways that would leave not just our continent, but our entire planet utterly transformed. The world we're imagining isn't just a different Europe, it's a different human species entirely, one that never learned to dream of tomorrow being better than today. And as we trace these implications forward through the centuries, we begin to see just how much of what we consider essentially human actually depends on lessons learned from humanity's darkest hour. But the true horror of this world without plague would reveal itself not in grand political failures or economic collapse, but in the small, suffocating details of daily existence. Picture a typical village in our alternate 1450, where the same families have worked the same narrow strips of land for 15 generations without a single meaningful change in their circumstances. The village of Millbrook sits in what we know as the English Midlands, but in this timeline, it remains virtually indistinguishable from its ancestor settlement of 1250. The same thatched roof hovels line the same muddy lane. The same manor house looms over the same collection of peasant dwellings. Even the names are the same, passed down like heirlooms from father to son, mother to daughter, in an endless cycle of repetition. Thomas Miller, great-great-great-grandson of another Thomas Miller, rises before dawn just as his ancestors did. At 25, he looks 40. His back is permanently bent from a lifetime of stooping over grain. His hands are gnarled claws, his teeth blackened stumps. He has never travelled more than 10 miles from the place of his birth, and he never will. Thomas cannot read. He cannot write. He owns nothing but the clothes on his back and a wooden bowl worn smooth by generations of use. He shares a single room with his wife, his 3 surviving children, his elderly mother, and 2 younger brothers. Privacy is a concept as foreign to him as flight. His wife, Margaret, is pregnant with their 6th child. 3 others died before their 2nd birthdays, claimed by diseases that in our timeline would be easily treatable, but in this world remain mysterious acts of God. She delivered the last baby herself, with only her mother-in-law's rough assistance, in the same bed where her husband's grandmother died, and where she herself will likely die. The children work alongside their parents from the age of 5. Little Anne, barely 7, spends her days gleaning grain from harvested fields, her small fingers bleeding from the sharp stubble. Her brother John, 9, tends the Lord's pigs, sleeping with them in their sty during the coldest winter nights. They play no games. They have no toys. They know no stories, except the few Bible tales repeated by the village priest. The priest himself, Father Benedict, is a man who learned his letters as a young novice, but has forgotten half of them through disuse. His sermons consist of the same warnings about hellfire and damnation that have echoed from this pulpit for centuries. He has never read a book that wasn't written before his grandfather's grandfather was born. The idea of questioning doctrine, of seeking new understanding, of finding God through reason rather than tradition, would strike him as not just heretical, but incomprehensible. When plague historically swept through medieval villages, it paradoxically freed survivors from these crushing limitations. Labour shortages meant that surviving peasants could demand better treatment, could negotiate for land, could even abandon their traditional lords entirely. But in our alternate world, where no such demographic catastrophe ever occurred, Thomas Miller and his family remain as trapped as insects in amber. The lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, represents the 4th generation of his family to rule this particular patch of earth. He lives in the same stone his great-grandfather built, surrounded by the same tapestries depicting the same biblical scenes. His education consists of learning to fight, to hunt, and to extract as much labour as possible from his human property. Sir Geoffrey owns Thomas Miller in every meaningful sense of the word. Thomas cannot leave the manor without permission. He cannot marry without consent. His children belong to the Lord just as surely as the cattle in the fields. When Thomas dies, his eldest son will inherit not land or wealth, but the same bondage that has defined his family for centuries. The Lord himself, despite his apparent privilege, lives in a cage only slightly larger than his peasants. His marriage was arranged to consolidate land holdings, His daily routine consists of the same activities his ancestors performed. He has never seen a play, never heard complex music, never contemplated art that wasn't purely functional. His library contains perhaps a dozen books, all copies of ancient texts. Innovation is not just discouraged in this world, it's actively dangerous. When young Willem the blacksmith develops a slightly more efficient way to shape horseshoes, the guild masters view it as a threat to traditional methods. When Sarah the weaver creates a new pattern for cloth, the other women whisper that she must be trafficking with demons. Change, any change, is viewed as inherently suspicious and probably evil. The seasonal rhythms that govern this community have remained identical for centuries. Spring planting follows the same patterns. Summer work continues the same routines. Autumn harvest uses the same tools and methods. Winter brings the same hungry months, when families huddle together and hope their stored grain lasts until the next growing season. Religious festivals provide the only breaks in this monotony, but even these follow scripts written centuries earlier. The same prayers are recited, the same rituals are performed, the same moral lessons are taught. The idea that religious experience might be personal, that individuals might seek their own relationship with the divine, remains as foreign as the concept of individual rights. Marriage in this world serves purely economic functions. Thomas Miller's wife was chosen not for love or compatibility, but because her family's tiny plot of land adjoined his family's slightly less tiny plot. Romance, the celebration of individual emotion that emerged from post-plague literature, never develops. Marriages are business arrangements negotiated by families and sanctified by a church that views romantic love as dangerous distraction from spiritual duty. Children are economic assets first, and individuals second. They work as soon as they can walk. They marry as soon as they can reproduce. They die young from diseases, accidents, and malnutrition that better circumstances might have prevented. The concept of nurturing individual potential, of education aimed at personal development rather than social function, remains unthinkable. Women in this world exist in a state of permanent legal childhood. Margaret Miller cannot own property, cannot make contracts, cannot even testify in legal proceedings without male guardianship. She moves from her father's authority to her husband's, to her son's, without ever experiencing a moment of independence. The economic opportunities that historically opened up for women during post-plague labour shortages never materialise. The village wise woman, Old Agnes, represents the sum total of medical knowledge available to this community. Her treatments consist of herbal remedies passed down through oral tradition, prayers to various saints, and the occasional application of leeches to drain bad blood. She has no understanding of anatomy, no knowledge of disease transmission, no concept of hygiene beyond basic cleanliness. When the sweating sickness strikes the village, as it does every few years, she can only pray and hope while families bury their dead. Trade in this community remains primitive and local. The weekly market in the nearest town offers the same goods that have been sold there for generations. A few pottery bowls, some rough cloth, basic iron tools made by methods unchanged since antiquity. The merchant who brings salt from distant regions is an exotic figure, almost magical in his ability to travel beyond the familiar horizon. Money exists, but plays a limited role in daily life. Most transactions occur through barter or through labour obligations owed to the Lord. Thomas Miller pays his rent not in coins, but in days worked on the Lord's land, in shares of his harvest, in chickens from his tiny flock. The sophisticated financial instruments that historically emerged from post-plague commercial complexity remain unknown. The concept of time itself operates differently in this world. Without mechanical clocks, which develop slowly without the precision demands of post-plague labour organisation, people measure time by natural rhythms. Dawn and dusk, the changing seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest. The idea that time might be precisely measured, that schedules might be coordinated, that efficiency might be improved through better time management, remains foreign. Books are treasures so rare that the village has never seen one outside the priest's possession of a single battered psalter. The printing press, if it exists at all in this world, remains a curiosity in distant cities rather than a revolutionary technology for spreading knowledge. Literacy is confined to a tiny clerical elite. The explosion of learning that historically followed plague-era social changes never occurs. No, art in this community serves purely functional purposes. The crude paintings in the church depict religious scenes in flat, stylized forms that haven't changed in centuries. The idea that art might explore individual emotion, might experiment with new techniques, might serve purposes beyond religious instruction, never develops. Creativity is channeled entirely into traditional crafts practiced in traditional ways. Music consists of simple folk songs passed down through generations and the Gregorian chant that echoes from the church during services. The complex polyphony that historically emerged from post-plague musical innovation remains unknown. Musical instruments are rare and primitive. The idea that music might be written down, that compositions might be preserved and shared, that musical complexity might develop over time, never emerges. Entertainment consists of seasonal festivals that follow ancient patterns and occasional visits from travelling minstrels who tell the same stories their predecessors told centuries earlier. The concept of secular drama, of literature that explores human psychology, of entertainment that serves no religious or moral purpose, remains undeveloped. Education, when it exists at all, consists of learning one's predetermined social role. Boys learn the skills their fathers practiced. Girls learn the domestic tasks their mothers performed. The idea that education might develop individual potential, might prepare people for advancement, might serve personal rather than purely social purposes, never emerges. The legal system operates according to customs so ancient that no one remembers their origins. Justice is administered by the Lord according to precedents passed down orally through generations. The concept of written law, of legal rights that transcend social status, of courts that operate according to rational principles rather than traditional authority, remains foreign. Punishment is swift, brutal, and public. Theft results in the loss of a hand. Adultery brings public humiliation and possible execution. Speaking against authority invites severe retribution. The idea that punishment might aim at rehabilitation rather than retribution, that justice might consider individual circumstances, that mercy might temper judgment, never develops. Disease strikes this community regularly and inexplicably. People fall ill and die without anyone understanding why. The connection between sanitation and health remains unknown. The idea that human action might prevent disease, that empirical observation might reveal natural causes, that systematic study might improve outcomes, never emerges. Superstition governs daily life in ways that make medieval Christianity seem rational by comparison. Every misfortune is attributed to supernatural causes. Crop failures result from divine displeasure. Illness strikes because of moral failings. Accidents occur due to demonic intervention. The idea that natural phenomena might have natural causes, that human reason might understand the world, that systematic observation might reveal truth, remains heretical. Mental illness is viewed as either divine punishment or demonic possession. The village madman, poor Simon, who talks to invisible companions, is alternately feared as cursed and revered as touched by God. The idea that mental conditions might have natural causes, that treatment might be possible, that compassion might be more appropriate than fear, never develops. Old age brings no comfort or respect in this world. The elderly, no longer able to contribute economically, become burdens on families already stretched to survival limits. They huddle in corners, forgotten and unwanted, waiting for death to release them from lives that offer no dignity or hope. Death itself remains a terrifying mystery. People die suddenly and inexplicably. The causes remain unknown and unknowable. Families mourn without understanding, accept loss without explanation, and continue living without hope that future generations might fare better. The cemetery beside the village church tells the story of this community in weathered stone markers. Generation after generation lies buried here, each having lived lives virtually indistinguishable from their ancestors. The same names appear repeatedly. The same ages at death recur with depressing regularity. The same simple inscriptions mark the passage of lives that never achieved anything beyond basic survival. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this community is not what it lacks, but what it has lost the ability to imagine. In our timeline, the social upheaval that followed the Black Death opened up possibilities that medieval people had never contemplated. Peasants began to dream of advancement. Workers started to negotiate for better conditions. Individuals began to see themselves as more than just components in a divine machine. In our alternate world, where no such upheaval ever occurred, the capacity for imagination itself has atrophied. Thomas Miller cannot conceive of a life different from his own, because no one in his community has ever lived such a life. The priest cannot imagine questioning doctrine, because no one in his tradition has ever done so successfully. The Lord cannot envision changing the social order, because it has never changed within living memory. This psychological limitation represents perhaps the deepest tragedy of our alternate timeline. It's not just that people are oppressed or impoverished, though they certainly are. It's that they have lost the ability to conceive of alternatives to their oppression and poverty. They cannot dream of better lives because they have no models of what better lives might look like. The children growing up in this world internalize these limitations from birth. They learn that questioning authority is dangerous, that seeking change is futile, that accepting their circumstances is not just practical, but morally correct. Each generation becomes slightly more resigned, slightly less capable of imagining alternatives, slightly more accepting of conditions that in our timeline would inspire rebellion. This learned helplessness extends to every aspect of life. When crop yields are poor, people accept it as God's will rather than seeking better agricultural methods. When disease strikes, they pray rather than investigating causes. When conflicts arise, they submit to traditional authorities rather than seeking just solutions. The cumulative effect of centuries of such thinking would be a population that has lost the essential human capacity for hope. Not just hope for better individual circumstances, but hope that circumstances can be better at all. This represents a kind of spiritual death that in some ways is more tragic than the physical death that the Black Death brought to our actual timeline. Yet even in this darkest of alternate worlds, traces of human dignity would persist. Parents would still love their children despite being unable to offer them better futures. Couples would still find moments of tenderness despite marriages arranged for economic convenience. Friends would still support each other through hardships, despite living in a system that viewed such bonds as secondary to social obligations. These small acts of human connection would provide the only light in an otherwise crushing existence. They would remind us that even under the most oppressive circumstances, something essentially human survives. But they would also highlight how much potential remains unrealized when social systems prevent people from developing their full capabilities. The village of Millbrook in our alternate 1450 represents millions of similar communities across a Europe that never experienced the demographic shock that historically transformed medieval civilization. Each represents thousands of lives lived and lost without ever achieving their potential. Each represents human creativity and intelligence trapped in social systems that have no use for individual achievement. Multiply this tragedy across continents and centuries, and you begin to grasp the full scope of what our alternate timeline represents. Not just different political arrangements or economic systems, but a fundamental limitation on human development that would have persisted for centuries beyond what actually occurred. This is the world that the Black Death accidentally saved us from. A world where human potential remained forever stunted by social systems that had calcified beyond the possibility of reform. In destroying medieval civilization, the plague cleared the ground for something unprecedented in human history. A society that valued individual achievement and believed in the possibility of progress. But as we trace the implications of our alternate timeline forward through the centuries, we discover that the effects would extend far beyond Europe itself. The ripple effects of this demographic catastrophe that never occurred would reshape global civilization in ways that would leave not just our continent, but our entire planet fundamentally transformed. The year 1500 arrives in our alternate timeline, with Europe still locked in social patterns that historically had been shattered 2 centuries earlier. But the implications extend far beyond European borders, because Europe's failure to develop affects every civilization it might have contacted. In our actual timeline, European expansion was driven partly by the demographic and economic pressures that followed the plague. Population recovery created demand for new resources. Social mobility created ambitious individuals seeking opportunities. Technological innovation provided the tools for ocean exploration. None of these factors exist in our alternate world. Instead of Portuguese caravels reaching the Indian Ocean or Spanish conquistadors landing in the Americas, we find a very different pattern of global contact. Chinese treasure fleets, which historically ended in the 1430s, continue sailing into the 1500s and beyond. Without European competition, Chinese maritime technology advances unopposed. Admiral Zheng and his successors established permanent Chinese bases in Southeast Asia, India, and East Africa. Chinese merchants and diplomats, rather than European ones, become the primary agents of cultural exchange between civilizations. The technological innovations that Chinese civilization had been developing for centuries, gunpowder, printing, navigation, continue evolving without European interference. By 1500, Chinese colonies dot the Indian Ocean. Chinese naval bases control key trade routes. Chinese merchants dominate commerce from Malacca to Mogadishu, and most significantly, Chinese explorers, following reports from Arab navigators, begin to contemplate voyages across the Atlantic. The first Chinese expedition to reach the Americas might arrive in the 1520s, decades before Europeans in our alternate timeline developed the capability for such voyages. The encounter between Chinese civilization and Native American societies would unfold according to entirely different patterns than the Spanish conquest that historically occurred. Chinese colonization practices, based on centuries of experience with diverse populations within their own empire, would likely emphasize trade and tribute rather than territorial conquest. Native American societies might find themselves incorporated into a Chinese tribute system rather than destroyed by European diseases and violence. The demographic catastrophe that historically wiped out Native American populations would still occur, as Old World diseases would prove just as devastating, regardless of which civilization brought them. But the political and cultural aftermath would be entirely different. Instead of Spanish colonial administration, we might see Chinese governors ruling American territories according to imperial Chinese principles. The implications for global development become staggering when we consider how different Chinese and European colonial approaches were. Where Europeans sought to extract wealth and convert populations to Christianity, Chinese colonialism historically emphasized integration and cultural synthesis. Native American societies might survive as autonomous regions within a Chinese imperial system, rather than being destroyed entirely. Mesoamerican and Andean civilizations, instead of being conquered by Spanish conquistadors, might find themselves adapting to Chinese administrative practices. The great cities of Tenochtitlan and Cusco might continue flourishing as regional capitals within a Chinese colonial empire. Indigenous knowledge systems might be preserved and integrated with Chinese learning rather than being suppressed in favor of European Christianity. The economic implications are equally profound. Instead of American silver flowing to Europe and disrupting global trade patterns, New World wealth might flow to China, further strengthening Chinese economic dominance. The price revolution that historically transformed European economics might never occur, while Chinese prosperity reaches unprecedented heights. But Chinese expansion wouldn't occur in isolation. Islamic maritime powers, particularly the Ottoman Empire and various Arab trading states, would also benefit from European weakness. Without European naval competition, Islamic expansion might continue unchecked across the Indian Ocean and into Southeast Asian waters. The Ottoman Empire, instead of being contained by European military innovations, might continue expanding into Central Europe. Vienna might fall to Ottoman forces, opening the way for Islamic expansion into the heart of the continent. The cultural boundary between Christian and Islamic civilizations might shift dramatically westward. Islamic scholars and merchants, freed from European competition, might establish themselves as the primary intermediaries between Asian and African civilizations. The great centers of Islamic learning, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, might experience continued growth rather than the relative decline they experienced historically. The encounter between Islamic and Chinese expansion might occur in the Indian Ocean, where both civilizations maintain significant naval presences. This could lead to either conflict or cooperation, but either way would likely result in technological exchange that accelerates development in both civilizations. Meanwhile, Africa would develop along entirely different trajectories without European slave trading pressure. The great kingdoms of West Africa, Mali, Songhai, the various Hausa states, would continue evolving without the demographic drain of the Atlantic slave trade. East African city-states would prosper through continued trade with Chinese and Islamic merchants. The absence of European demand for slaves might allow African societies to develop their human resources internally rather than exporting them. The technological and cultural exchange that occurred through trade with Asia might accelerate African development rather than being disrupted by European slaving activities. Ethiopian civilization might maintain its independence and continue developing its unique Christian culture without European interference. The Kingdom of Congo might avoid the disruption that historically followed Portuguese contact. West African states might develop more sophisticated political and economic institutions without the distorting effects of slave trading. But perhaps most significantly, the global balance of power would remain heavily tilted toward Asia for centuries longer than it historically did. China, the Islamic world, and India would retain their positions as the dominant centers of global civilization. Europe would remain a peripheral region, economically and technologically backward compared to Asian standards. India, without European colonial pressure, might continue developing along its traditional trajectories. The Mughal Empire might last much longer and achieve greater stability. The sophisticated commercial and manufacturing systems that historically made India wealthy might continue evolving without European disruption. The encounter between different Asian civilizations might produce technological and cultural innovations that surpass anything achieved in our timeline. Chinese printing technology might combine with Islamic scholarly traditions to produce an explosion of learning. Indian mathematical concepts might merge with Chinese mechanical innovations to accelerate scientific development. The Protestant Reformation, which historically emerged partly from the intellectual ferment following plague-era social changes, might never occur in our alternate Europe. The Catholic Church might maintain its unity and authority for centuries longer. The religious wars that historically devastated Europe might be avoided, but at the cost of the intellectual freedom that emerged from religious competition. Scientific revolution might occur in China or the Islamic world, rather than Europe. The empirical method might be developed by Chinese natural philosophers or Islamic scholars rather than European scientists. The technological innovations that historically gave Europe global dominance might emerge in very different cultural contexts. The printing press, if it spreads beyond China at all in this timeline, might first reach Islamic lands rather than Europe. The explosion of literacy and learning that followed might occur in Arabic or Persian rather than European languages. The intellectual foundations of modernity might be laid in Baghdad or Beijing rather than Paris or London. Medical advancement might follow similar patterns. Without the practical urgency created by recurring plague outbreaks in Europe, medical innovation might occur more rapidly in civilizations that face different health challenges. Chinese medicine might develop more sophisticated theoretical frameworks. Islamic medicine might advance more rapidly through continued exchange with Indian and Chinese traditions. Mathematical and astronomical development might continue advancing in Islamic and Chinese contexts rather than shifting to Europe as it historically did. The great observatories of Samarkand and Beijing might remain the world's leading centers of astronomical research. The mathematical innovations that enabled later scientific revolution might emerge from Islamic algebra or Chinese geometry. Navigation technology might advance more rapidly in Chinese and Islamic contexts, where ocean exploration continues actively. The improvements in shipbuilding and navigation that historically enabled European expansion might occur in Chinese shipyards or Islamic ports. The age of exploration might be dominated by Asian rather than European navigators, but technological development wouldn't be the only difference. Cultural and intellectual exchange would follow entirely different patterns. The Renaissance, which historically emerged partly from the rediscovery of classical texts through Islamic sources, might never occur in Europe. Instead, Islamic and Chinese civilizations might experience their own cultural flourishing as they encounter and adapt each other's traditions. Art and literature might develop along different trajectories as Chinese and Islamic traditions influence each other more directly. The architectural innovations that historically emerged from European Renaissance might occur in Islamic or Chinese contexts instead. The cultural synthesis that produces great art might happen in Cairo or Nanjing rather than Florence or Rome. Philosophy might develop differently as Chinese and Islamic intellectual traditions encounter each other without European mediation. The questioning of traditional authority that historically emerged from plague-era European trauma might never occur, but different forms of intellectual innovation might emerge from Asian cultural exchange. Legal and political development might follow different patterns as Chinese administrative practices encounter Islamic governance traditions. The concept of individual rights might never emerge, but different forms of justice and governance might develop that serve human needs in different ways. Economic systems might evolve differently as Chinese and Islamic commercial practices merge and compete. The capitalism that historically emerged from post-plague European social changes might never develop, but alternative economic systems might prove equally or more effective at organizing human productive activity. The global trade networks that connect these civilizations might become more sophisticated and extensive than anything that existed historically. Without European disruption, traditional Asian trade routes might develop into more complex and efficient systems. The Silk Road might evolve into an even more elaborate network of cultural and economic exchange. Urban development might follow different patterns as Chinese and Islamic cities grow without European competition. The great cities of Asia might become even larger and more sophisticated than they historically were. Beijing, Baghdad, and Delhi might surpass any European city by margins that dwarf historical differences. Population growth might continue unchecked in regions that historically faced European demographic pressure. Asian and African populations might grow larger and more prosperous without the disruptions caused by European expansion. The global center of demographic weight might remain firmly anchored in Asia. But perhaps most significantly, the very concept of global civilization might develop differently. Instead of the European-dominated world system that historically emerged, we might see a multipolar world where Chinese, Islamic, and other Asian civilizations maintain separate but interacting spheres of influence. The cultural values that dominate global civilization might be very different from those that historically emerged from post-plague Europe. Confucian concepts of social harmony might prove more influential than European individualism. Islamic principles of social justice might shape legal development more than European concepts of individual rights. The environmental impact of human civilization might be very different as well. European expansion historically led to massive environmental disruption in the Americas and other regions. Chinese or Islamic expansion might follow different patterns that prove more or less environmentally sustainable. Climate change might occur along different timelines, as industrialization, if it occurs at all, happens in different regions according to different principles. The environmental consequences of human development might be better or worse than what historically occurred, but they would certainly be different. The story of human civilization itself might be fundamentally different in ways that extend far beyond politics or economics. The very definition of progress, the understanding of human potential, the relationship between individual and society, might develop along trajectories that would be unrecognizable to us. Yet as we contemplate these vast differences, we must remember that they all stem from a single biological event that never occurred. The absence of one pandemic in 14th century Europe would have reshaped not just European development, but the entire course of global civilization. This reminds us how contingent our own world is. How much of what we take for granted depends on specific historical circumstances that might easily have been different. The modern world we inhabit emerged not from inevitable progress, but from a complex chain of events that might have unfolded very differently. The Black Death, for all its horror and tragedy, accidentally created the conditions that made our modern world possible. In destroying medieval civilization, it cleared the path for developments that we now consider essential to human progress. Individual rights, scientific thinking, democratic governance, economic opportunity, social mobility, all of these emerged from the specific circumstances that followed demographic catastrophe. In our alternate timeline, where that catastrophe never occurred, humanity might have developed very different values and institutions. Whether these would have been better or worse than what actually emerged is impossible to say. They would simply have been different, reflecting different priorities and possibilities that emerged from different historical circumstances. But as we trace our alternate timeline into the 16th and 17th centuries, the differences become even more dramatic. By 1600, our plague-free Europe has become something almost unrecognizable to modern eyes, a continent locked in social amber while the rest of the world surges ahead. The year is 1603, and in our alternate timeline, Europe remains a patchwork of feudal territories where change occurs at glacial pace. The population has continued its relentless climb, reaching perhaps 150 million souls pressed into the same social structures that governed their ancestors 3 centuries earlier. Every available acre is under cultivation, including marginal lands that should never have been farmed. Forests exist only as hunting preserves for the nobility. Wild animals have been hunted to near extinction. The social pressure is almost unbearable. In England, peasant families work plots so small that a bad harvest means certain death. The average holding provides barely enough food for survival in good years. Children routinely die of malnutrition-related diseases. Adults look decades older than their actual age. The life expectancy hovers around 30 years, kept low not by epidemic disease but by chronic malnutrition and the grinding poverty that defines existence for 90% of the population. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Chinese colonies are thriving in ways that would have been impossible under European rule. The city of New Beijing, established on the site where New York historically stood, has grown to perhaps 200,000 inhabitants. Unlike the extractive Spanish colonies of our timeline, Chinese settlements focus on sustainable development and integration with local populations. Native American tribes that survived the initial disease outbreaks have been incorporated into the Chinese imperial system as autonomous regions. The Iroquois Confederacy operates as a Chinese vassal state, maintaining its traditional governance while adopting Chinese agricultural and technological innovations. Cherokee territories in the southeast function as Chinese protectorates, their leaders educated in Chinese schools but ruling according to traditional customs. The integration isn't without problems. Cultural misunderstandings abound. Some tribes resist Chinese authority through guerrilla warfare. Others embrace Chinese ways so enthusiastically that traditional cultures disappear within generations. But the overall pattern differs dramatically from European colonialism. Instead of replacement and extermination, we see adaptation and synthesis. Chinese agricultural techniques, refined over millennia, prove extraordinarily productive in American soil. The Three Sisters agriculture of corn, beans, and squash that Native Americans developed gets enhanced with Chinese fertilization methods and crop rotation systems. Yields increase dramatically. The Chinese discover new crops like potatoes and tomatoes centuries before Europeans in our timeline, leading to earlier population growth in China itself. American silver flows not to Europe but to China, further strengthening an already dominant economy. Chinese merchants established trade routes connecting American resources with Asian markets. Furs from the Great Lakes region reach Chinese courts. American cotton is processed in Chinese mills. Tobacco cultivation, developed by Chinese agricultural experts working with Native American knowledge, creates new forms of wealth. But the most significant difference lies in knowledge exchange. Chinese scholars, working with Native American intellectuals, begin documenting indigenous knowledge systems that in our timeline were largely destroyed. Traditional ecological knowledge is preserved and integrated with Chinese scientific methods. Medical practices that combined shamanic traditions with Chinese herbal medicine produce innovations that neither culture could have achieved alone. The Aztec Empire, instead of being destroyed by conquistadors, becomes a Chinese protectorate. Tenochtitlan, renamed Great Lake City, serves as the administrative capital of Chinese North America. The sophisticated Aztec calendar system is integrated with Chinese astronomical observations, producing calendrical accuracy that surpasses anything available in Europe. Aztec mathematical concepts, particularly their understanding of zero and place value notation, combine with Chinese arithmetic to produce computational innovations. The Aztec educational system, which historically produced high literacy rates, gets enhanced with Chinese printing technology. Books in Nahuatl, produced on Chinese printing presses, preserve indigenous literature while spreading Chinese ideas. The Inca Empire follows a similar pattern. Instead of Spanish colonial administration, we find Chinese governors working with traditional Inca administrative systems. The remarkable Inca road network gets enhanced with Chinese engineering techniques. Quipu, the Inca system of record keeping using knotted strings, gets supplemented with Chinese writing systems. Machu Picchu becomes a center of learning where Chinese scholars study Inca engineering techniques, while Inca intellectuals learn Chinese mathematics and astronomy. The synthesis produces architectural innovations that combine Inca stoneworking skills with Chinese mechanical knowledge. Meanwhile, in our alternate Europe, none of these developments occur. European populations remain too large and too impoverished to support exploration. The technological innovations that historically enabled ocean voyaging develop slowly, if at all. Without the labor pressures that historically drove innovation, European technology remains centuries behind what we might expect. The heavy plough, which historically revolutionized agriculture, remains an expensive curiosity used only on the richest estates. Most peasants still scratch at the earth with wooden implements their great-grandfathers would recognize. The three-field system spreads slowly, if at all, because there's no economic pressure to improve efficiency when labor is so abundant and cheap. Watermills remain simple grain grinding operations rather than developing into the complex mechanical systems that historically emerged. The gear trains and mechanical linkages that would later enable clockwork and precision machinery never develop beyond the most basic applications. Time itself remains measured by church bells and the sun's position rather than mechanical precision. In the Islamic world, a very different story unfolds. The Ottoman Empire, unchallenged by European military innovations, continues its expansion deep into the European heartland. By 1600, Ottoman forces control not just the Balkans, but have pushed well into what we know as Germany and Poland. The great fortress cities that historically protected Christian Europe were never built because the technological and economic resources to construct them never materialized. Vienna falls to Ottoman siege in 1598, opening the way for Islamic expansion into Central Europe. The cultural boundary between Christian and Islamic civilizations shifts dramatically westward. Prague becomes an Ottoman administrative center. The religious wars that historically devastated Europe take on entirely different character as Islamic and Christian populations intermingle under Ottoman rule. The Ottomans, inheriting the administrative sophistication of Byzantine and Islamic traditions, prove far more capable rulers than the feudal lords they replace. Christian peasants often welcome Ottoman rule because it offers better legal protections and more opportunities for advancement than the rigid feudal hierarchies they've known. Islamic scholars establish schools and libraries in conquered European cities. Christian intellectuals, exposed to Islamic learning traditions, begin to question the rigid orthodoxy that has defined European Christianity for centuries. But this questioning occurs within Islamic rather than Christian frameworks, producing very different intellectual developments. Meanwhile, Ottoman naval power, unchallenged by European competition, dominates the Mediterranean completely. Ottoman fleets establish bases along the North African coast and begin exploring Atlantic waters. The first Islamic expeditions to reach the Americas might occur in the early 1600s, decades before Europeans in our timeline develop such capabilities. The encounter between Islamic civilization and Native American societies would follow patterns entirely different from either Chinese or European colonization. Islamic legal traditions, with their emphasis on religious tolerance for people of the book, might extend to Native American spiritual practices in ways that preserve indigenous traditions while encouraging conversion. Native American societies might find themselves incorporated into the Ottoman millet system, where different religious and ethnic communities maintain their own laws and customs, while acknowledging Ottoman political authority. This could preserve indigenous cultures in ways that neither European nor Chinese colonization historically achieved. But the most profound changes occur in Asia itself, where Chinese civilization, freed from European competition, reaches heights of sophistication that dwarf anything achieved historically. The Forbidden City in Beijing becomes a center of learning that attracts scholars from across the known world. Chinese universities, established along Confucian principles but incorporating knowledge from conquered American territories, produce innovations that accelerate technological development. Chinese printing technology, enhanced by American paper-making techniques learned from indigenous peoples, produces books in quantities that would have seemed impossible in our timeline. Literacy rates in China soar beyond anything achieved historically. The examination system that traditionally governed Chinese bureaucracy expands to include knowledge from American and Southeast Asian territories. Chinese medicine, always sophisticated, gets revolutionized by the addition of American medicinal plants and Native American healing techniques. Diseases that plagued Asian populations for millennia find cures in the synthesis of Chinese herbal knowledge with American botanical resources. Life expectancy in Chinese territories begins to increase dramatically. The demographic implications ripple across the globe. Chinese populations, supported by American agricultural resources and protected by improved medical knowledge, begin growing at unprecedented rates. By 1650, China's population might reach 200 million, larger than all of Europe combined and supported by resources from multiple continents. Chinese naval technology, driven by the practical needs of governing a trans-Pacific empire, advances rapidly. Chinese shipyards produce vessels that dwarf anything built in Europe. Navigation techniques, combining Chinese astronomical knowledge with American indigenous understanding of ocean currents, enable reliable trans-Pacific travel. Trade routes connecting China, America, and Southeast Asia become highways of cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions flow freely across oceanic distances. The Chinese language begins to serve as a global lingua franca in ways that Latin never achieved in Europe. But perhaps the most significant development occurs in the realm of ideas. Chinese philosophers, exposed to American indigenous concepts of governance and Islamic traditions of jurisprudence through Ottoman diplomatic contacts, begin developing political theories that synthesize different cultural approaches to human organization. The mandate of heaven, traditional Chinese justification for imperial rule, gets modified by American concepts of consensus-based decision-making. Islamic principles of legal equality influence Chinese administrative practices. The result is a form of governance that combines imperial efficiency with greater attention to individual rights than either tradition achieved historically. These political innovations spread throughout the Chinese sphere of influence. Native American societies under Chinese protection find their traditional governance systems enhanced rather than replaced. Indigenous concepts of environmental stewardship get incorporated into Chinese administrative practices, producing more sustainable approaches to resource management. The environmental implications become significant as Chinese colonies expand across American territories. Unlike European colonization, which historically led to massive environmental destruction, Chinese expansion follows different patterns. Traditional Chinese agricultural techniques, refined over millennia, prove less destructive to American ecosystems. Native American fire management practices, integrated with Chinese forestry knowledge, maintain American forests in ways that European colonization never achieved. The passenger pigeon survives. American bison herds, managed according to indigenous hunting practices enhanced by Chinese organizational methods, remain stable rather than facing near extinction. Meanwhile, in our alternate Europe, environmental degradation reaches catastrophic levels. The continued population pressure forces cultivation of increasingly marginal lands. Forests disappear entirely, except as aristocratic hunting preserves. Soil exhaustion leads to declining agricultural yields, just as population pressure reaches maximum intensity. The Little Ice Age, which historically coincided with the Black Death's aftermath, hits this overpopulated Europe like a hammer blow. Cooler temperatures reduce agricultural yields precisely when every available acre is already under cultivation. The famines that result make the Great Famine of 1315 look mild by comparison. By 1650, our alternate Europe faces what can only be described as a Malthusian catastrophe. Population has outstripped agricultural capacity to such a degree that mass starvation becomes routine. Entire regions depopulate as people flee in search of food that doesn't exist. The social order begins to collapse under pressures that make the historical Black Death seem gentle by comparison. But unlike the plague, which killed quickly and created opportunities for survivors, this crisis offers no relief. The deaths are slow and agonizing. Families dissolve as members abandon each other in desperate searches for sustenance. Villages become ghost towns, not because of disease, but because of hunger so profound it destroys human social bonds. The psychological impact proves even more devastating than the physical suffering. The plague, for all its horror, was seen as an external force that struck randomly. This crisis emerges from the social system itself, making it impossible to blame external causes. People begin to question not just specific authorities, but the entire basis of social organization. Religious authority, instead of being strengthened by suffering as it might have been during plague times, faces challenges unlike anything in European history. When people are starving because the social system cannot feed them, blaming divine will becomes increasingly difficult. The questioning that historically emerged from plague trauma finally arrives in Europe, but centuries later and under far more desperate circumstances. The peasant uprisings that result make the historical Peasants' War look like a minor disturbance. Entire regions revolt against feudal authority. Lords find themselves besieged in their castles by populations driven to madness by hunger. The violence exceeds anything Europe has seen since the barbarian invasions. But these uprisings lack the organizational sophistication that historically emerged from post-plague social changes. The rebels have no alternative vision of social organization because they've never experienced anything but feudalism. They can destroy the existing order, but cannot create anything to replace it. The result is not revolution, but collapse. European civilization begins to disintegrate under pressures it cannot handle. Trade networks break down as regions turn inward to protect scarce resources. Cities empty as urban populations flee to countryside that cannot support them. The cultural achievements of medieval Europe, its cathedrals, its universities, its artistic traditions, crumble as the social structures that supported them disappear. By 1700, our alternate Europe has become something unrecognizable. The population has crashed from famine and violence to perhaps 50 million, lower than it had been in 1000. The survivors huddle in fortified settlements, suspicious of strangers and hostile to change. The feudal system has collapsed, but nothing has emerged to replace it except local strongmen ruling through violence. Technology has regressed to levels not seen since the early Middle Ages. The watermills that once ground grain stand abandoned because there's no grain to grind. The few books that survive the chaos moulder in ruined monasteries because no one remembers how to read them. The very concept of learning beyond basic survival skills has been forgotten. Meanwhile, the rest of the world surges ahead. Chinese civilization, supported by American resources and unchallenged by European competition, has achieved heights of sophistication that make the historical Renaissance look primitive. Chinese cities boast populations that dwarf anything Europe has ever seen. Chinese scholars have produced libraries that contain more knowledge than all of medieval Europe ever possessed. The Ottoman Empire, having absorbed much of Eastern Europe, has become a bridge between Asian and African civilizations. Ottoman scholars, with access to Chinese innovations through diplomatic exchange and Islamic traditions through their own heritage, produce cultural syntheses that surpass anything achieved in our timeline. African civilizations, freed from the demographic drain of European slave trading, have developed along trajectories that seem almost miraculous compared to our timeline. The kingdoms of West Africa have grown into sophisticated empires rivaling anything in Asia. East African city-states have become major centers of global trade, connecting Asian and African commercial networks. The global balance of knowledge and power has shifted so dramatically that our collapsed Europe appears as a backward periphery, a cautionary tale of what happens when social systems fail to adapt to changing circumstances. European languages, never having spread through global colonization, remain local dialects spoken by a few million survivors huddled around the ruins of medieval civilization. The irony becomes almost unbearable when we consider what our timeline actually achieved. The Black Death, that great catastrophe that killed perhaps 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and Africa, accidentally created the conditions that made the modern world possible. By destroying rigid social structures, it cleared the path for innovations that would eventually benefit all of humanity. The scientific revolution that emerged from post-plague questioning of authority gave us modern medicine, which has saved billions of lives. The economic innovations that developed from post-plague labor shortages created prosperity that lifted entire populations out of poverty. The political theories that emerged from post-plague social mobility led to concepts of human rights that now protect people around the world. In our alternate timeline, where the plague never occurred, these developments either never happen or emerge centuries later, under very different circumstances. The cost in human potential is almost impossible to calculate. How many scientists never made discoveries because they spent their lives ploughing fields? How many artists never created because they had no time for anything beyond survival? How many political innovations never emerged because the conditions that made them necessary never arose? But the tragedy extends beyond individual loss to encompass entire civilizations. European culture, which in our timeline spread around the world and contributed to global development, remains trapped in medieval frameworks that offer nothing to human advancement. The languages that produced Shakespeare and Newton carry nothing but folk tales about ancient kings. The traditions that created Gothic cathedrals and Renaissance art produce nothing but crude religious artifacts. The global implications ripple forward into what we might recognize as the early modern period. By 1750, our alternate world has become something that would seem alien to anyone familiar with our timeline. China dominates global civilization to a degree that no single power ever achieved historically. The Chinese Empire spans continents, connecting Asia, America, and parts of Africa through trade networks and cultural exchange. Chinese has become the global language of learning and commerce. Chinese educational systems, enhanced by knowledge from conquered territories, produce scholars whose understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy surpasses anything achieved in our timeline. Chinese medicine, enriched by American and Southeast Asian traditions, has eliminated diseases that plagued humanity for millennia. The Ottoman Empire serves as a junior partner in this Chinese-dominated world, controlling much of what we know as Europe and the Middle East. Ottoman administrators, trained in Chinese governmental techniques but operating within Islamic legal frameworks, have created administrative systems that efficiently govern diverse populations across multiple continents. Africa, freed from European interference, has developed into a collection of sophisticated kingdoms and city-states that participate as equals in global trade networks. African scholars, educated in Chinese universities but drawing on indigenous knowledge traditions, contribute innovations that benefit global civilization. But Europe itself has become a backwater, a region of scattered settlements and ruined cities that serves mainly as a cautionary example of what happens when civilizations fail to adapt. The survivors speak corrupted versions of medieval languages and practice degraded forms of medieval Christianity. They have no books, no schools, no technology beyond the most basic metalworking and agriculture. When Chinese explorers finally reach European shores in the mid-1700s, they find populations so primitive that initial contact resembles European encounters with hunter-gatherer societies rather than meetings between civilizations. The Chinese established trading posts along European coasts, but there's little to trade for except basic raw materials and human labor. The psychological impact on European survivors proves devastating. To discover that the rest of the world has achieved heights of civilization that make their ancestors' greatest achievements look primitive creates a cultural trauma that some communities never recover from. Some European groups retreat further into isolation, viewing the outside world as demonic. Others embrace Chinese civilization so completely that their own traditions disappear within generations. The global knowledge networks that emerge from this Chinese-dominated world follow patterns entirely different from our timeline. Instead of European universities spreading around the world, we find Chinese educational institutions serving as centers of global learning. Instead of European languages serving as vehicles for international communication, Chinese dialects become the common tongue of scholarship and trade. The scientific revolution, when it finally occurs, emerges from Chinese rather than European contexts. The empirical method gets developed by Chinese natural philosophers, drawing on traditions that synthesize Confucian rationalism with American indigenous observation techniques and Islamic mathematical precision. The results surpass anything achieved in our timeline because they draw on a broader base of cultural knowledge. Mathematical innovations emerge from the intersection of Chinese numerical systems, Islamic algebra, American indigenous geometric concepts, and African astronomical observations. The resulting mathematical sophistication enables technological developments that our timeline never achieved. Navigation becomes so precise that global travel becomes routine. Engineering reaches levels that enable construction projects dwarfing anything built historically. But perhaps most significantly, the political and social innovations that emerge from this multicultural synthesis create forms of governance that balance individual rights with social stability in ways that our timeline never achieved. The Chinese Mandate of Heaven, modified by American indigenous consensus traditions and Islamic concepts of legal equality, produces governmental systems that serve human needs more effectively than anything known historically. These innovations spread throughout the Chinese sphere of influence, creating global standards of governance that emphasize both efficiency and justice. Human rights, when they finally emerge as concepts, develop not from European ideas about individual liberty, but from Chinese notions of social harmony, enhanced by American indigenous concepts of collective responsibility. The environmental implications of this alternate development prove equally significant. Chinese agricultural techniques, refined over millennia and enhanced by American indigenous knowledge, prove far more sustainable than European methods ever were. The global ecosystem, managed according to principles that balance human needs with environmental health, remains stable in ways that our timeline never achieved. Climate change, if it occurs at all, follows different patterns, because industrialization develops along different lines. The coal burning that historically drove European industrial development never occurs on the same scale, because Chinese technology, drawing on broader knowledge bases, develops alternative energy sources earlier and more efficiently. The global population grows more steadily and sustainably because Chinese governmental systems, enhanced by knowledge from multiple cultures, prove better at managing resources and preventing the boom-bust cycles that characterized European development. By 1800, global population might reach levels that took our timeline another century to achieve, but supported by more sustainable practices and more equitable distribution systems. Trade networks connecting all inhabited continents create cultural exchange opportunities that our timeline never experienced. Art, music, literature, and philosophy develop through continuous interaction between civilizations rather than the colonial domination patterns that characterized our timeline. The result is cultural richness that surpasses anything achieved historically. But the tragedy of our alternate Europe continues to haunt this otherwise successful global civilization. The millions of people who might have contributed to human knowledge and culture remain trapped in poverty and ignorance. The languages that produce great literature carry nothing but degraded folk traditions. The regions that might have become centers of learning remain cultural wastelands. When Chinese scholars finally begin studying European ruins in the late 1700s, they find evidence of a civilization that once showed promise, but collapsed under pressures it couldn't handle. The Gothic cathedrals, half ruined and overgrown with vegetation, testify to architectural skills that disappeared when the social systems that supported them failed. The scattered manuscripts, damaged by centuries of neglect, hint at intellectual traditions that might have contributed to global knowledge if they had survived. These discoveries prompt Chinese philosophers to contemplate the fragility of civilization and the importance of adaptive social systems. European collapse becomes a case study in how even promising civilizations can fail if they become too rigid to change when circumstances demand it. The lessons learned from European failure help Chinese civilization avoid similar pitfalls as it continues developing. But for the European survivors themselves, these discoveries offer little comfort. To learn that their ancestors once built great cathedrals and established universities when they themselves can barely maintain basic agriculture creates cultural despair that some communities never overcome. The knowledge that they are the degraded remnants of what was once a promising civilization proves more devastating than simple ignorance would have been. Some European communities attempt to reconstruct their lost heritage, but without the social and economic foundations that originally supported it, these efforts remain largely unsuccessful. A few monasteries managed to preserve fragments of medieval learning, but without the broader cultural context that gave it meaning. This knowledge remains sterile and disconnected from contemporary needs. The languages themselves begin to evolve in ways that reflect their speakers' reduced circumstances. Complex grammatical structures disappear because they serve no purpose in societies focused entirely on basic survival. Vocabulary shrinks as concepts related to learning, art, and sophisticated social organization become irrelevant. Within a few generations, the languages that once carried medieval European culture become simple dialects, suitable only for discussing weather, crops, and basic social relationships. Religious traditions follow similar patterns of decay. The sophisticated theology that medieval European scholars once developed survives only in degraded forms that emphasize resignation and acceptance rather than intellectual engagement with divine questions. The artistic traditions that once produced illuminated manuscripts and carved stone decorations survive only as crude folk crafts that bear little resemblance to their sophisticated ancestors. Yet even in this darkest scenario, traces of human dignity persist. European communities that survived the collapse developed their own forms of social organization adapted to their reduced circumstances. These may lack the sophistication of Chinese or Ottoman systems, but they serve human needs within their limitations. People still love their families, still create modest forms of beauty, still seek meaning in their reduced circumstances. The children born into these communities know nothing of their ancestors' achievements, but they adapt to their circumstances with the resilience that characterizes human beings everywhere. They develop skills appropriate to their environment, create relationships that provide emotional support, and find ways to experience joy despite their limitations. But from the perspective of global civilization, European collapse represents a massive waste of human potential that continues to influence global development. The knowledge that might have emerged from European contributions to global culture never materializes. The innovations that might have resulted from European participation in global knowledge networks never occur. The artistic and literary traditions that might have enriched global culture remain stunted and provincial. The global civilization that emerges without European participation, while successful in many ways, lacks the cultural diversity that might have emerged from genuine global participation. Chinese dominance, benevolent though it may be, creates a form of cultural hegemony that limits the range of human expression and innovation. This becomes particularly apparent in the realm of political and social experimentation. Chinese governmental systems, however sophisticated, represent only one approach to human organization. The alternative models that might have emerged from European development never appear. The political innovations that historically emerged from European competition between different systems never occur. The result is global civilization that, while stable and prosperous, may lack the dynamic tension that drives continued innovation and development. Without competition between different approaches to human organization, without the creative conflict that emerges from cultural diversity, global civilization may achieve a form of stagnation that, while comfortable, limits human potential in subtle but significant ways. By 1800, our alternate world has become something simultaneously impressive and tragic. The achievements of Chinese-dominated global civilization surpass anything our timeline accomplished at similar dates. The levels of prosperity, the sophistication of technology, the extent of global trade networks all exceed historical benchmarks. Yet the absence of European contributions creates a form of cultural homogeneity that may limit long-term human development. The question of whether this alternate world is better or worse than our own becomes impossible to answer definitively. The immediate human suffering is certainly less than what our timeline experienced through centuries of European warfare, colonization, and exploitation. The environmental damage is probably less severe because Chinese development follows more sustainable patterns. The global inequality is likely reduced because Chinese governmental systems emphasize social harmony over individual accumulation. But the cultural vitality may be less than what our timeline achieved through the creative tension between competing civilizations. The rate of innovation may be slower because Chinese dominance reduces the competitive pressures that historically drove rapid technological development. The range of human expression may be narrower because one cultural tradition, however sophisticated, cannot encompass the full spectrum of human possibilities. As we approach what we might recognize as the modern era, these trade-offs become increasingly apparent. Our alternate world has achieved forms of stability and prosperity that our timeline never knew, but it may have sacrificed the dynamic creativity that made our timeline's achievements possible. The Black Death, that great catastrophe that killed so many, may have been the random event that made human greatness possible by preventing human civilization from settling into patterns that, while comfortable, limited human potential. This is perhaps the most profound lesson of our alternate timeline, that human progress may require disruption, that creativity may emerge from crisis, that the very disasters that seem to threaten civilization may be necessary for its continued development. The Black Death was undoubtedly a tragedy that caused immense suffering, but it may also have been the accident that saved humanity from a form of stagnation that would have been even more tragic in the long run. As we contemplate this possibility, we begin to understand that our own world, with all its problems and imperfections, may be the result of a series of historical accidents that created conditions for human flourishing that would never have emerged from planned development. The chaos and competition that characterize our timeline may be essential ingredients in the recipe for human greatness. But our story is not yet complete. As we move into what our timeline knows as the age of revolution and industrial transformation, the implications of our plague-free alternate history become even more dramatic and far-reaching than anything we've yet imagined. By 1850, the world without the Black Death has evolved into something that would be utterly alien to anyone from our timeline. The global civilization dominated by Chinese imperial administration has achieved a form of technological and social sophistication that surpasses anything our world accomplished until well into the modern era. Yet it remains fundamentally different in ways that would reshape every aspect of human existence. The great Chinese capital of Beijing has grown into a metropolis of over 2 million inhabitants, larger than any city that existed in our timeline until the industrial age. But this growth follows patterns entirely different from European urbanization. Instead of the chaotic, polluted industrial cities that characterized our timeline's development, Chinese urban planning creates organized, efficient cities that balance human needs with environmental sustainability. The city is laid out according to principles that synthesize traditional Chinese urban design with innovations learned from governing diverse populations across multiple continents. Wide boulevards accommodate not just human traffic, but also the elaborate canal systems that connect different districts. Public gardens and parks provide green space for every neighborhood. Waste management systems, drawing on techniques developed in different climates and cultures, maintain sanitation standards that European cities wouldn't achieve for another century. The technological infrastructure supporting this urban civilization reflects the synthesis of knowledge from multiple continents. Water systems combine Chinese hydraulic engineering with American indigenous water management techniques. Transportation networks use roads built according to Inca engineering principles enhanced by Chinese organizational methods. Communication systems employ printing technologies that have evolved far beyond anything known in our timeline. But perhaps most significantly, the social organization of this urban civilization reflects political innovations that our timeline never achieved. The traditional Chinese examination system has been modified by American indigenous concepts of consensus building and Islamic principles of legal equality. The result is a form of governance that combines administrative efficiency with genuine representation of diverse interests. Citizens, regardless of ethnic or cultural background, can advance through merit-based examinations that test not just traditional Chinese learning, but also knowledge relevant to their local circumstances. A Mayan engineer can qualify for administrative positions by demonstrating expertise in both Chinese governmental principles and indigenous hydraulic techniques. An African merchant can achieve bureaucratic rank through examinations that combine Chinese commercial law with traditional African trading customs. This synthesis creates a form of multiculturalism that our timeline never experienced. Instead of one dominant culture imposing itself on others, we find a dynamic interaction where different traditions contribute to an evolving global civilization. Chinese administrative efficiency provides the framework, but the content draws from humanity's entire cultural heritage. The economic implications of this system prove equally revolutionary. Instead of the extractive capitalism that characterized our timeline's development, this Chinese-dominated world develops economic systems based on principles of sustainable circulation. Wealth flows through networks designed to support continued production, rather than accumulating in the hands of individual owners. The concept of private property exists, but is balanced by collective responsibilities that ensure individual accumulation doesn't undermine social stability. American indigenous concepts of stewardship influence resource management. Islamic prohibitions against usury shape financial systems. African traditions of communal labor organization influence industrial development. The result is economic growth that continues over centuries without the boom-bust cycles that characterized our timeline. Living standards rise steadily for all population groups rather than creating the extreme inequality that marked our timeline's industrial development. Environmental degradation remains minimal because economic systems incorporate sustainability principles from the beginning, rather than trying to retrofit them after damage has occurred. Agricultural development follows similar patterns of synthesis and sustainability. Chinese intensive cultivation techniques, enhanced by American crop varieties and indigenous farming methods, produce yields that support much larger populations than our timeline achieved while maintaining soil fertility over generations. The Irish potato famine, the Dust Bowl, and other agricultural disasters that marked our timeline never occur because diverse cropping systems prevent over-reliance on single varieties. The global trade networks that connect this civilization span all inhabited continents through shipping systems that have evolved far beyond anything our timeline achieved. Navigation techniques combining Chinese astronomical knowledge, Islamic mathematical precision, and American indigenous understanding of ocean currents enable reliable global commerce. Ships built according to design principles that synthesize different cultural traditions prove both efficient and durable. But the most remarkable achievement of this alternate civilization lies in its approach to knowledge and learning. The university system that has evolved combines the best features of different educational traditions from around the world. Chinese emphasis on rigorous examination merges with Islamic traditions of scholarly debate, American indigenous methods of experiential learning, and African oral traditions that preserve and transmit complex knowledge systems. The Great University of Global Learning in Beijing attracts students from every continent. Its libraries contain manuscripts in dozens of languages, preserving knowledge that in our timeline was lost through conquest and cultural destruction. Mayan mathematical texts sit alongside Chinese astronomical treatises. Islamic medical knowledge is studied next to American indigenous pharmacology. African metallurgical techniques are taught alongside Chinese engineering principles. This intellectual synthesis produces innovations that our timeline never achieved. Mathematics develops through the interaction of different numerical systems and geometric concepts. Chinese algebra encounters American indigenous spatial reasoning and Islamic computational methods, creating mathematical tools that enable technological advances centuries ahead of our timeline. Medical knowledge reaches extraordinary levels of sophistication through the combination of different healing traditions. Chinese herbal medicine, enhanced by American indigenous plant knowledge, produces pharmacological capabilities that surpass anything our timeline achieved until the modern era. Islamic surgical techniques refined by Chinese precision create medical procedures that save lives our timeline couldn't save for centuries. Astronomical observation, conducted at observatories that span the globe and coordinate their findings, produces understanding of celestial mechanics that enables navigation and calendar making of unprecedented accuracy. The synthesis of Chinese record-keeping, Islamic mathematical analysis, American indigenous sky knowledge, and African stellar traditions creates astronomical science that surpasses anything our timeline accomplished before the telescope. But perhaps the most significant development occurs in the realm of what we might call social science. The interaction between different governmental traditions produces theoretical understanding of human organization that our timeline never achieved. Chinese administrative experience combines with American indigenous consensus building, Islamic legal principles, and African community organization to create systematic knowledge about how human societies function. This knowledge gets applied practically in governing the global empire, creating administrative systems that balance efficiency with justice in ways our timeline never accomplished. Local communities maintain their cultural traditions while participating in global networks that provide security and prosperity. Individual achievement is rewarded while collective welfare is protected. The technological implications of this knowledge synthesis become staggering as we approach what our timeline knows as the industrial age. Instead of the coal-powered industrialization that characterized European development, this Chinese-dominated civilization develops alternative energy sources much earlier and more efficiently. Water power, developed through the combination of Chinese hydraulic engineering and American indigenous techniques, produces mechanical energy on scales that dwarf anything our timeline achieved with watermills. Wind power, enhanced by understanding gained from different climatic conditions around the world, supplements water power with reliable energy generation. Most significantly, the systematic study of natural phenomena that emerges from this multicultural knowledge synthesis leads to understanding of steam power and mechanical principles much earlier than in our timeline. But instead of developing these technologies through the chaotic, exploitative methods that characterized our timeline's industrial revolution, this civilization applies them through planned development that considers environmental and social consequences from the beginning. The first steam engines, developed in Chinese workshops by engineers trained in global knowledge systems, are designed not just for efficiency, but for sustainability. Fuel sources are chosen to minimize environmental impact. Factory systems are organized to protect worker welfare while maximizing production. Transportation networks are planned to serve social needs rather than just commercial interests. By 1800, this alternate world has achieved industrialization without the social disruption and environmental destruction that marked our timeline's development. Cities grow larger and more prosperous without becoming the polluted, overcrowded slums that characterized our timeline's urban centers. Factory workers enjoy protections and benefits that our timeline's industrial workers wouldn't achieve for another century. The global implications of this sustainable industrialization prove revolutionary. Instead of the resource extraction and colonial exploitation that fueled our timeline's industrial development, This civilization uses its global networks to circulate resources and knowledge in ways that benefit all participants. American raw materials are processed using techniques that leave local environments undamaged. African mineral resources are extracted through methods that compensate local communities fairly. Transportation networks connecting all continents enable rapid movement of both goods and people, but according to principles that maintain cultural diversity rather than imposing homogenization. A merchant can travel from Beijing to Cusco to Timbuktu using reliable, efficient transportation, but each destination maintains its distinctive cultural characteristics while participating in global networks. Communication systems develop even more rapidly than transportation. Printing technology, enhanced by paper-making techniques learned from different cultures, enables mass production of books in dozens of languages. Literacy spreads globally much faster than in our timeline because educational systems are designed from the beginning to serve diverse populations. The optical telegraph systems that begin to connect major cities enable rapid long-distance communication decades before our timeline achieved similar capabilities. Messages can travel from Beijing to Cairo to New Beijing in days rather than months, enabling coordination of global activities that our timeline couldn't achieve until the electric telegraph. But perhaps the most profound difference lies in the realm of